Hi, this is Charley Pride. Pride, the Charley Pride Story, as narrated by me. I came from a family of 11 children, 8 boys and 3 girls. The oldest were Bessie and Jonas McIntyre, my mother's from a previous marriage. The rest of us were the sons and daughters of Mac Pride. There would have been more, but 3, including twin boys, were stillborn and a 4th was miscarried. I was my mother's 4th born, behind Bessie and Jonas and Mac Jr. and my father's 2nd. After me came Catherine, Louis, Edward, Joel, Harmon, Maxine, and Stephen. My father named me Charley Frank Pride, but the person who typed the birth certificate put an EY on the end of Charles, so officially I was Charley. Daddy refused to acknowledge that clerical error and insisted on calling me Charles. When he scolded me, which was often, he used, "Charley Frank, come here." We lived in a 3-room house, and the children slept 3 and 4 to a bed, lying alternately head to foot. Many a time I was awakened in the night by toes jabbing me in the face or shivering because the covers had been pulled to the other end. The house was little more than a tin and cracked wood shack, and in the winter there was no way to keep it warm throughout the night. Everyone in the family had morning chores before going to school or to the fields. We were awakened before sunrise. The girls helped Mother get the dough started for biscuits, and the boys had to bring in the water and firewood, first for the kitchen stove and then for the pot-bellied heater. After the fires were going and Mother's kettle was filled with fresh water, the hogs had to be fed before we could eat. Depending on the season, we headed to school or followed him to the field. If a choice had to be made between work and school, school always won. Mother and Daddy were determined that their kids get an education and they would never pull us out of school to work, the way a lot of families did. Mother was a talkative and outgoing person, and I was a lot like her. She was philosophical and could find something positive in almost every situation, no matter how bad it was. In the material ways, we were poor, but Mother always told us that everyone has something that makes them rich in their own way. I was looking through a magazine when I was 6 or 7 and saw an advertisement for a new car, about the most dazzling thing I had ever seen. I tried to imagine my mother riding in that car. "Mom," I said, carrying the magazine over to where she was washing clothes, "if I had $1 million, I could buy that car for you." She stopped washing, dried her hands, and sat down with me. She said, "You're right. You could buy me that car if you had $1 million. That's a lot of money. But I'll tell you something. There are people who would give up a whole bunch of millions for what you've got." My eyes became wide. What did I have that was worth $1 million? "Hold out your hand," Mother said. "See? You've got 5 fingers on that hand, 5 on the other hand. You've got both your eyes, both your legs. Some people don't have those things." She planted seeds like that, and they outlived her. Even now, someone will say, "How are you doing?" And without thinking, I'll answer, "Pretty good. I got all my fingers in both eyes." I was always a dreamer, in childhood especially. I used to sit and look up at the clouds and wonder if I could walk on them, and where they would take me if I could. My tendency to daydream and fantasize probably had something to do with my itch to discover what was in the world beyond the Delta. I had nothing against Mississippi. The inequities of segregation were painful, but that was my home and those were my people. I love Mississippi and do to this day. When I go there to visit my father, I am still taken by its beauty and bounty. I love to see things grow, and growing things is what the Delta does best. But I always had the feeling that there was something else I was supposed to do besides following in my father's footsteps. Daddy always said I was the most aggravating of his children. I've never denied that I was mischievous. I would do about anything to get a laugh or get attention. I didn't always consider that the consequence would be another round with Daddy's belt. I didn't do hurtful things, but I guess I was a nuisance. For a while, my great-grandpa lived with us, and I taunted him mercilessly. Harmless teasing, but annoying nonetheless. He slept in a long nightgown, and before bedtime or in the morning, I would lift the hem of it, and as though I were going to peek underneath. "Get away from there," he would snap, pushing me aside with a bony hand. In a few minutes I would be back. One day he was sitting on the porch and I made several tugs on his gown, but jumped back each time before he would swat me. Finally, he grabbed the hem, lifted it almost to his waist, and snapped, "All right, there it is, look, look." That stopped my pestering him about his nightshirt. But I found other ways. I flipped water on him when he was in the yard or ran up behind him and snapped his suspenders against his back. One day I was teasing him and leading him around a chair. I led him around and around that chair until he got dizzy. Daddy caught me doing it and dealt out the usual punishment. Looking back on it, I realized I shouldn't have done those things to him. It didn't occur to me then just how much of a pest I was. I loved that old man and probably just wanted him to notice me. I still talk to him. Every once in a while, when I think about him, I look up and say, "Great-granddaddy, I didn't mean nothing." When I was about 8, I hit upon the idea of jumping off the barn using an umbrella as a parachute. Ours were not a tall barn, and getting on the roof was no trouble. I popped the umbrella open and jumped. The umbrella made a whooshing sound as the ribs bent upward, ripping the fabric as they went. I fell like a plump acorn into a small stack of hay and wood. I had no idea Mac Pride was anywhere around, but he was beside me almost as soon as I stood up and brushed the dust and the hay off myself. I cried as much from the scratches sustained in the fall as from Daddy's switch. I guess I deserved that one. I had torn up our only umbrella. The truth is, I grew up not liking my father very much. I loved him, and there was a lot about him that I admired and respected, but I didn't like him. Our household was a stern environment. Too stern. The children were terrified of our father. He beat us for the smallest offenses, and we learned to read the look in his eyes, to anticipate just what we needed to do to avoid being knocked down. He was never playful with us, never praised us for our accomplishment, and never hugged us, but did show affection. When he decided that something would be a certain way, there was no further discussion. No one in the family could express an opinion or a preference without risking his strap. If we attempted to speak up, we were cut short. I wanted his approval, which was no small ambition. One day, he and I were picking cotton, and I was determined to weigh in with the heavier sack. We were working side by side, each pulling 2 rows. I stayed right beside him, but when we got to the scales, his sack weighed more. "What's going on here?" I asked him. He said, "Come here," and led me back down the rows I had picked. He turned over a leaf to expose a bowl. "You missed that one." Another leaf, that one too. Cotton opens on the leaves as well as above them. He was getting everything, and I was getting only what I could see. He said, "There's an art to everything, son," and went back to work. Mother sometimes tried to tell him he was too rough on us, but she rarely sided openly with the children against him. She may have felt that it was not the proper thing to do, or that it would have been futile anyway. She was not afraid of him as we were. Many nights I fell asleep listening to them argue and awoke the next morning to the same battle sound. Though she stood up to him, I doubt that she won many arguments. Some of my father's severity may have been dictated by the harsh way we had to live. Poverty alone was an impairment to a normal family life, demanding too much time just for survival and leaving too little for being together, for talking and understanding. With so many kids to tend to and so much work to get done every day, Mother and Daddy didn't have time to stand over each one of us all the time. Rules were simply laid down and we were expected to obey them. Although I liked school, I acted up there almost as much as at home and spent a lot of time in the principal's office, where the whippings were as ferocious as any dad could dish out. The principal or whoever was administering the treatment would recruit 2 boys to help him. One took you by the arms, the other by the feet, and held you faced up in a horizontal position. The principal swung his strap so that it came underneath your rump with pounding force. Using the 2 students' aids served another purpose. It allowed them to witness what was in store if they, too, got out of line. Schools had the authority to do that in those days, but one of our principals got into trouble for going a bit too far. He tried to intensify the whippings by putting a little pieces of wire on the end of the strap. It would turn young flesh into bloody pulp. Daddy was in town after school one day and bumped into the principal. "We had to give Charley a busting today," the principal told him. Daddy snorted and said, "Yeah, well, who hasn't?" Over time, I have come to realize that Daddy was not unfeeling. He was just unable to express his emotion in the normal way. If he couldn't express his affection in words, he sometimes did it with subtle gestures. I can recall the time when he drove the cotton to be gin, and on the way back he would stop and buy ice cream for us kids. He drove the wagon as fast as he could to get home before the ice cream melted. He showed concern for his children by using the strap to keep us on a straight and narrow path, and he showed tenderness by protecting and caring for us. We all survived the hardships of our youth and turned out to be reasonably solid citizens. It had rained off and on for a couple of days, and the ground was charcoal muck. Winter was coming on, and Mother and Daddy were trying to get the last cotton out of the field. I was only about 5 years old and not much help with the crops, especially on a day like that. When the ground was wet, you had to fold your cotton sack up and carry it rather than drag it behind you. So Mother went to pick cotton with Daddy and left me and Mac Jr., who was 7, at home to look after our sister Catherine and baby brother Louis. As young as we were, we knew how to take care of ourselves. When you grow up in the country, you learn self-reliance early. You watch for snakes or listen for bobcats or other animals. You learn their behavior and how to deal with them. Some animals, though, are less predictable than others. Late in the morning, Junior and I took Catherine and Louis outside. We were playing in the yard when I saw a car creeping along the narrow, muddy road that ran by our house. There were 2 men inside, white men. The car stopped at our yard, and from the way the 2 men looked at us, we sensed this was not a friendly visit. We stood motionless and stared at them. They pointed at us and laughed and yelled things I really didn't understand. Then one of them held up a set of false teeth in one hand, snapped them open and shut, and grinned at us. I had never seen false teeth before, had no idea what they were, but didn't like the looks of them. "These are your Uncle Samscott's teeth," the man said, grinning, clicking them again and again. Pure horror spread through me. "Oh, Lord, they've killed my uncle and cut out his teeth," I thought. Junior and I stood frozen by fear. I heard one of them say, "Get that little one." The other said, "No, get that little big-headed one over there." They jumped out and sprinted toward Junior. He and I might have been able to outrun them, but that would have meant leaving Catherine behind. If we screamed, no one would hear us. In an instant, they grabbed Junior, tossed him into the back seat, and drove away. All I could think of was getting to Mother and Daddy. I left Catherine alone and ran toward the field. It was hard going in that mud, and my heart was pounding, and my lungs were on fire. I must have gone a quarter of a mile before I saw Daddy, standing between cotton rows with his sack tied up on his shoulder. When I reached him, I was winded and gasping, barely able to talk. Daddy grabbed me and shook me. "What is it, boy? What is it?" I blurted out, They got Junior." The white men took Junior. They dropped their cotton sacks and ran toward the house. I was right behind them, exhausted but still running on fear and adrenaline. When we reached the house, Junior was sitting in the doorway holding the baby in his arm. "They're stuck down there," he told Daddy, pointing toward the car, which was bogged down into the mud 100 yards or so down the road. Junior told Daddy he jumped out and ran when the car stopped. We couldn't see anybody in the car or around it, but Daddy went into the house and got his gun. He may have been too rough on us, whipped us too much, but he didn't allow anybody else to mess with his children. The fear I had seen in him earlier became a rage. I don't think I have ever seen him so angry. If those men were still down by the car, there might well be a killing. Mother begged and pleaded with him. "He's here now," she said. "He's safe. We got him back. Don't go down there." She had no illusion about what would happen if he found those men. It would be as bad for Daddy as for them. Justice for black people was still a long way off. A black man who killed a white man, no matter what the circumstances, could expect just about anything but justice. Mother pleaded with him not to go. He was a proud and stubborn man, but he, too, was aware that nothing but trouble was down that road. Mother convinced him to let the law handle it. Mike Omar was a popular sheriff and probably a good one, but he didn't seem to think that 2 white men snatching a black child out of his yard and driving away with him was much of a crime. "You just settle down, Mike," he told Daddy. "I'll look into it. They probably were just having a little fun and didn't mean no harm." Somehow I don't think he would have seen the humor in it if two black men had snatched a white child from its home. That was the most traumatic experience of my life, and the sheriff didn't think it was any big deal. From the car's registration, it was not difficult for the sheriff to identify the two men, but he never told Daddy who they were, just that they were from over around Clarksdale. Nobody was ever arrested, but Sheriff Omar probably felt he had to do something. So if only because of Daddy's reputation, he protected what was his and was not timid with anyone who violated his property or his personal code. The sheriff went to Clarksdale to spread the word around, "Don't mess with Mike Pride." It was all the justice we got. Sledge was like 100 other small Delta towns in those days. Downtown was one block of storefronts separated from the railroad tracks by a partially paved street. There was a grocery store, a barber shop, a hardware and farm supply store, a general merchandise store, a cafe, and a gas station. Across the street, snuggled up to the tracks, was a cotton gin and grain elevator. In school, we were reminded every day of racial separation and the inequities that went with it. From my classroom, I could look out and see the school for the white kids. It was a newer, larger building with a gymnasium where they could play when the weather was bad. Our school had no such facility, and when it rained, we took recess at our desk. The white kids had school buses to pick them up in the mornings and deliver them home each afternoon. The black kids walked. I can still remember how the white kids would yell at us and call us names as the buses passed us on those dusty roads. When I was about 13 years old, I was hanging around town on a Saturday afternoon and ran into 3 white boys I had met casually. They were baseball players, a couple of years older than I. They invited me to sit in the car with them and talk. It wasn't supposed to be done, but I had never had much aversion to testing the rule. And that's true. I got into the car. For a while, we were just for kids killing a lazy day and making small talk, mostly about baseball. That was a few years after Jackie Robinson had been signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers, making him the first black player in the Major League. To say that he was my idol would be an understatement. As far as I was concerned, Jackie Robinson had rewritten the future. I mentioned the previous day's Dodger game and how Robinson had stolen 2 bases. "Damn," one of the boys said, "that nigga can run." I'm not sure what I felt, anger, hurt, disgust. A pleasant conversation about something we all loved had turned ugly, even if the kid who said it had not meant it to be. I could have punched him. I certainly wasn't afraid to, but it would have accomplished nothing. He still would have thought of Jackie Robinson as a nigger. Nothing would have knocked that out of his head, and I saw no reason to try. I opened the door and got out. "Where you going, Charley?" one of them asked. "I don't want to listen to this kind of talk," I said. My daddy's instincts were becoming my own. Protect yourself and what's yours, but don't fight the battle if there's nothing to be won. A few years later, I got a job in the gas station in Sledge. Everyone else who worked there was white, and they treated me well enough. But one day I pumped gas for a customer, took his money, and went inside to give it to the owner, Otis Jenkins. He handled the cash register. "Otis," I said. Before I could finish, a guy inside snapped his head around and said, correcting me, "Mr. Otis." I nodded and waited for him to make change, saying nothing. When I finished work that day, I went home, still a little wounded by the experience. I never returned to that job. I could have grown up to be as militant and hostile as anyone, and there was a brief period when I felt that I would. Whenever I felt that way, I would remember something Mother said to me once. "Don't go around with a chip on your shoulder. There's good people everywhere. There's good people here. You've got a lot you're going to have to do, and you can't do it carrying a load of resentment with you." Those words still follow me around. There was a lot I wanted to do, and the time I spent thinking about how I was better than somebody else, or worrying about somebody else's attitude, was time I could put to better use. As far back as I can remember, the radio held a special fascination for me. I allowed myself to be drawn inside that box and absorbed into the music and drama and sports shows that occupied our evening. I rode with the Lone Ranger and fought with the Phantom and laughed with Amos and Andy, not knowing at the time that they were not black comedians, but 2 Jewish boys named Freeman Gosden and Charles Correll. It was from that old Philco radio that I also learned to love country music, and I guess I'm indebted to my father for that. He controlled the knobs, and every week he set the dial to WSM in Nashville for the Grand Ole Opry. I had been exposed to other music, blues and gospel mostly, but Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, and Hank Williams came into our house regularly. It was natural that my taste in music would lean in that direction. I sang along with those guys, memorized their songs, and country music just grew inside me. I never consciously tried to mimic their voices, to sing like them, but because I had a knack of imitating sounds and dialects, I had trouble convincing my brothers and sisters of that. Charley, my sister Bess, asked me once, she said, "How come you want to sing white folks' music?" Truthfully, I had never really thought of it. What came from my throat was my voice, no one else. No one had ever told me that whites were supposed to sing one kind of music and blacks another. I sang what I liked in the only voice I had. My first guitar was a mail order purchase from the Sears Roebuck catalog when I was 14. It was an inexpensive Silvertone, but I spent most of the year saving for it. I learned a few chords and discovered that by using my index finger like a capo and playing open bar chords, I could get a lot of mileage from those few. Jimmy Rogers, who had several big hits, including Honeycomb, back in the 1950s and 60s, played guitar that way. But the guitar had to be tuned differently for bar chords to a lower pitch, and I learned to do that by ear. I would sit by the radio and wait for the last chord of a song and tune the guitar to it. I've often wished that I could have taken lessons and become a better musician, but that method had served me pretty good. My brothers and sisters all sang too, and they all have good voices. We used to sing together a lot, but not one of us, as far as I can recall, thought of singing as a way to make a living. As far as I was concerned, my future was in baseball. Once I saw what Jackie Robinson had did, that was my goal. Believing that life would be easier elsewhere, I dropped out of school at 15 and went to live with my uncle, Robert Pride, my father's oldest brother in Clarksdale. For a while, life was easier. I hung around the pool halls a lot, enough to become a pretty good player. And when it was time for school to be out, I would run down to Myrtle Hall School and check out the girls. I wasn't drinking or getting into trouble, just idling and drifting. Before long, my uncle cracked down, and I discovered that he could be about as hard as Daddy. He told me when to be in at night, ordered me to stay away from pool rooms, and gave me an ultimatum: enroll in school or find a job. I got a job hopping cars at Deacon Drive-In. It didn't take long to learn that there wasn't much future in hopping cars. I went back home, got back in school, and plotted my next move. Early in the spring, I went to Memphis to offer myself to the Red Sox. Homer Goose Curry, the manager, gave me a quick trial, but he already had a strong pitching staff. While I was hanging around town, I met a guy named Jim Ford who was putting together an all-Negro team to go up north and play in the Iowa State League. I signed on with him, although I was a little hesitant about hitting the road. Mother was about to give birth and had not been feeling well. I told her I would send her an address when I got to Des Moines, and she promised to write when the baby was born. Things started out badly in Iowa and got worse. If I wasn't worrying about Mother, I was worrying about how to survive. Ford had arranged for us to stay in a rooming house in Des Moines, but we had no salaries. Our only income would be from our percentage of the gate. For the first couple of weeks, it rained nearly every night and we were unable to play, which meant we didn't get paid. The little money I took with me vanished in a few days, and I began to think I might starve before we made any money. I got so hungry that I pulled up weeds and washed them off and ate the roots. Meanwhile, I hadn't received any word from home. Every day I asked the woman who ran the boarding house, did I get a letter? And each time, the answer was the same. I never had any proof, but I always suspected that she was opening our mail and throwing it away. She could see that we were destitute and probably thought we were writing home for money. If she opened a letter and found no money in it, she couldn't very well bring it to us and say, "Here's your mail." Mother would have written to me, and I was convinced, and some of the other guys also were not getting mail they expected. Lena and Hungrier, we left Des Moines and went to Wall Lake, which is Andy Williams' hometown. There too, rain caused games to be canceled nearly every night, and we still were not making any money. Things were pretty bleak until a businessman named August Fisher came to our rescue. He ran a National Oats Company in Wall Lake, and people around there called him the Popcorn King because that was one of his company's major products. He subsidized us until we could get into some playing time. Once we were able to play, we didn't win many games, so Ford went back down to Memphis and raided the Red Sox, enticing some of the best players to switch teams. I don't know how he did it. The Red Sox paid $100 a month and $2 a day meal money. You didn't get rich playing in Memphis, but you didn't have to eat weeds either. To make room for them on the roster, he cut me and a few others from the team and sent us home. Not only was I going home unemployed, but the homecoming would be gloomy for another reason. Mother had given birth to twin boys. They were stillborn and would be buried long before I could get back. It occurred to me that Jim Ford had done me one huge favor. By pirating talent from the Red Sox and shipping me back from Iowa, the Sox would be looking for pitchers. After a few days in Sledge, I headed back to Memphis to have another talk with Goose Curry. He did not offer me a contract, but he gave me a uniform and put me on the roster. I became a bona fide professional baseball player with a regular paycheck, a home stadium, and hopes bigger than a thunderhead. Walking onto the grass at Martin Stadium first time was almost like a religious experience. Players whose names will never be forgotten had walked on that same grass, stood at that same plate, raced around those same base paths. Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks, Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson, anybody who ever played in the Negro American League would have played in Martin Stadium at one time or another. Playing for the Red Sox was both an adventure and an ordeal. We were given small living quarters at Martin Stadium, and while the pay was enough to get by on, it didn't leave much for partying. But I was pitching and playing the outfield, and except for the financial strain, having the time of my life. I was on my own, something I had wanted for a long time, paying my own way and showing my stuff now and then to a major league scout. As they say in the Delta, I was walking in high cotton. On road trips, I often stood in the aisles of the bus and sang country songs, all those Hank Williams and Roy Acuff tunes I learned listening to the Grand Ole Opry. The team was not in unanimous agreement about my talent. "Knock off that noise" was a fairly common comment, but a few gave me encouragement. "You sing pretty good," one of the other players said to me one day. "What are you doing playing baseball for $100 a month and $2 a day meal money? You could do better singing." "I want to go to the major leagues," I told him. In the off-season, I went back to Sledge and tried to finish high school. The principal made every effort to accommodate me. He even let me play on the school's basketball team. But each year, it became more difficult. Being 2 or 3 years older than the other kids in my class made me feel out of place. I managed to finish the 11th grade. Mother had drilled into me the importance of getting a high school diploma, but as my baseball career seemed to find its footing, it was hard to focus on anything else. William Dizzy Dismute was a scout for the New York Yankees, the first black man to hold that position. He was also the secretary of the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro American League, and he knew the players in the league pretty well. After my first year with the Sox, Goose Curry encouraged Dizzy to take a look at me. I received a letter from him about the time spring training was getting underway. He offered me a $300 bonus to sign with the Yankees farm team in Boise, Idaho, and told me to report, if interested, to Rio Vista, California, where the team was holding spring workout. Because I was a minor, Mom and Daddy had to sign for me. I don't think Daddy was really in favor of it. It meant I would have to drop out of school again and go to the Class C team in a place that seemed as far away as another planet. But his offer was persuasive. $300 for signing a piece of paper? You could pick cotton all season and not make that much money. Mother and Daddy signed the contract. Spring training went pretty well. I had a strong pitching arm, but a tendency to overwork it, throwing too hard and before I was ready. But when we broke camp, I was in the rotation and feeling good. Everything was going fine until we got to Lodi, California. I pulled a muscle in my shoulder and had to come out of the game. I stayed with the team until we broke camp and returned to Boise. The manager told me he was sending me down to Class D. You're going to Fond du Lac, Wisconsin until you get back into shape. I flew to Chicago and took a bus to Fond du Lac and stayed with the team for a week. Again, I tried to push the arm too soon, and it stayed sore the whole while. The manager gave me a bus ticket back to Memphis. Goose Curry put me back on the Red Sox squad, but left to coach a new team, the Louisville Clippers. Being formed in the Negro American League, he took me and a guy named Jesse Mitchell with him. We took spring training with them in Biloxi, Mississippi, but our stay was short. The Clippers needed a bus to travel in, and the only way they could raise money was by selling players. Goose sold Jesse Mitchell and me to Sue Bridgeport, who owned the Birmingham Black Barons, for enough to buy a bus. Jesse and I may have the distinction of being the only players in history to be traded for a used motor vehicle. Birmingham was another dead end. Sue Bridgeport sold the team at the end of that season, and we were all cut loose. The next year, I scoured the country for a place to play, eventually finding my way to El Paso. I had fun playing down there. We drew good crowds, and many of the local restaurants had team pictures and newspaper stories about us tacked on the walls. But I was not unhappy for the season to be over. I went to Colorado to stay with my sister Catherine. Sometime in late January, I had a premonition that something was wrong back home. I was working odd jobs in Colorado trying to save money to buy a car, but something told me I had to get home. I believe in things like intuition and mental telepathy. Believe that it's possible to sense when someone you're close to is ill or in danger. The feeling I had was so strong that it frightened me. With the little money I had saved toward a car, I bought a bus ticket to Sledge. When I was gone, Mother and Daddy had some kind of row, and she left him and went to stay with his nephew in Lambert. She got sick while she was there and wasn't feeling very well. When I went to see her, I told her I would be back the next day. I think I will always feel guilty because I didn't go back. I was hanging out with some buddies and goofing off when she got worse and had to be taken to the hospital. Dad and I brought her back home, but she was in a lot of pain. The doctors kept her heavily sedated with morphine. Every time the drug wore off, he would come to the house and shoot her up again. On this third or fourth visit, I asked the doctor, "What is wrong with my mother?" "I don't rightly know," he said. That went on for nearly a week. Dad and I stayed with her the whole time, feeding her and washing her and trying to ease her pain. Under the morphine, she slept a lot. Without it, she suffered. One afternoon, she was hurting real bad, and Daddy went to get the doctor. By the time he got back, she was dead. My insides were torn up. There's that second when you think she's gone, no more mother. And you realize what you've lost. She was the one soothing thing in my life, and then she died, and I couldn't understand why. We requested an autopsy to find out what she died from. The doctor said it was an acute meningitis with septicemia. We've always believed that she was allergic to morphine and was killed by the morphine. Her funeral was held on a spring day when the skies poured blinding rain into the Delta. The last rites were said in a small white church beside a dirt road a few miles south of Sledge, and she was buried in a cemetery near Crenshaw. I've never been back to her grave, and I'm not planning on going back. I don't think it is possible to love anyone more than I love my mother. Even after all these years, more than 30 years now, I don't think I could bear the hurt of standing on the ground where she lies. My ties to Sledge had been fragile enough, but Mother's death seemed to cut the cords altogether, and I was anxious to leave. Another baseball season was getting ready to start, so I made another pilgrimage to Martin Stadium. I managed to rejoin the Red Sox, and going into the 1956 season, I was in better form than ever. A few Major League scouts showed up, interested in me, and I began the season playing well enough to keep them on the hook. My pitching arm had never been stronger. My switch hitting was paying off with a batting average of over 300, and I had good speed in the outfield. The quota system loosely employed by the Major League team was a hefty obstacle. After Jackie Robinson made it in 1947, the integration of baseball evolved slowly. It took a few years before every team had a black player, and a few years passed before a team had more than one. By 1956, 2 of 3 was still pretty much the limit. but it was an opportunity, if a small one. Everything was on track for me that year until we got to Sykeston, Missouri for a game with the Birmingham Black Baron. Before that game, I was hitting .367, had 10 home runs, 7 wins on the mound, all of them close and low scoring. At Martin Stadium the night before we left for Missouri, I had a home run. A scout from the St. Louis Cardinals, I was told, would be in Sykeston the next day to watch me pitch. In each of the first 2 innings, I struck out the side and held the Barons scoreless. The third inning was a disaster. The first batter grounded out, the second batter soft popped to right field, but our usual right fielder wasn't playing that position. In his place was a catcher, wearing a catcher's mitt. A catcher's mitt was designed for a very special purpose, and in the entire history of baseball, it is unlikely that anybody ever tried playing this outfield wearing one. It would be just as easy to scoop up grounders or shag flies with a brick in your hand. A ball bounced off his mitt, and the runner advanced to third base. I stood on the mound staring at right field and fuming. I shouldn't have gotten angry, but I did. And it showed on the next pitch, a curveball. Instead of stretching and putting my body into it, I stepped on the rubber and stood straight up and nonchalantly brought my arm over my shoulder and flipped the wrist down. Something snapped in my elbow, and the pain shot through the whole arm. I bent the arm a couple of times trying to shake off the ache, got the ball back, and threw a fastball. The agony nearly sent me to my knees. Goose Curry came to the mound signaling for a new pitcher. I didn't argue with him. It was over. The Cardinal scout who was there that night found out that I had cracked a bone in my elbow, and I never saw him again. Teams in our league didn't have trainers in those days. We had small rosters, which meant you had to play every day. Even pitchers got no days off. You threw every 4 days and played another position in between. If you got hurt, you were cut from the team with no pay and had to go nurse your wounds on your own. My oldest brother, Jonas, he lived in St. Louis, so I went there to rest my arm and hoped that it would recover enough for a comeback. Jonas helped me to get a job doing handyman work for some people around their house. I washed windows and cleaned up around the place, and all the while trying to give my arm as much rest as possible. I decided to move on. Rather than going home, I headed north to Chicago to stay with my cousin, Mary Neither. She put me up for a few weeks and helped me get my arm back in shape by rubbing it with salve and alcohol. It began to feel better, and I tried throwing again, afraid to try a curveball and pretty certain that my fastball had lost some of its zip. I reasoned that my best chance of getting back in the game was to develop a knuckleball, a pitch that didn't have to be thrown hard to be effective. Most of the time, nobody knows where a knuckleball will go. Not the pitcher, not the catcher, and especially not the batter. The pitch is easy enough on the arm that some good knuckleballers have played into their mid and late 40s. So, believing it was my only passport back to the game, I worked on that pitch with a passion. As the arm got stronger and the pain went away, I thought of returning to Memphis to see if I could win my job back. Goose Curry was leery when I walked into Martin Stadium that summer. Only 3 months had passed since I injured my arm, and he was convinced that it needed more time to mend. I feel fine, I argued, and I'm developed a pretty good knuckleball. He watched me throw a few times and finally gave in, reinstated me on the team. There was still a lot of season left, and it turned out to be one of my best years in baseball. I won 14 games and was bound for the All-Star game. Along the way, I met the woman I was going to marry. We met in Memphis in a place called the Gay Hawk, a restaurant and hangout for ball players and fans just down the street from Martin Stadium. I had gone there with a date, and we were leaving, and I saw some of my buddies from the team sitting at a table with 3 girls I had never met. My date kept walking, but the lure of 3 attractive females caused me to pause at the table. I was going out with 2 or 3 other girls at the time, but when you're 19 years old, you can never have too many. One of these guys introduced me to the 3 girls, Catherine Baldwin, Paulette Coran, and Paulette's sister, Rosine. My attention went immediately to Rosine, who was sitting at the end of the table. "Hey, I like your hair," I said. She had very pretty hair. She didn't answer, just gave me one of those "who do you think you are" looks. I wasn't used to that and wasn't about to give up. Call me tomorrow at Martin Stadium and I'll take you to the movies, I said. The next day I was in my room and heard one of the players outside yell, "Charley, you got a phone call." I scrambled down to the pay phone and said, "Hello? Do you know who this is?" a female voice asked. "No," I said. "Didn't you tell a girl last night that you liked her hair and for her to call you and you would like to take her to the movie?" All right, I thought. The old charm wins again. "What time do you want me to pick you up?" "I'm not the girl," the voice said. "I'm Catherine Baldwin." "Well, why didn't Rosine call?" "She's not going to call." "If you want to see her, you'll have to do the calling yourself," she said. Oh boy, the hard-to-get type I mentioned. When you're a hot shot with the Memphis Red Sox, girls call you. This one didn't know the rules. "All right," I said. "Where does she work?" "She's a cosmetologist that live out in Binghamton, in a section of Memphis." The team was leaving for Omaha at 3 o'clock that afternoon, and there was plenty of time. I caught a bus to Binghamton. When I arrived, the beauty parlor wasn't busy, so I sat down and made small talk with Rosine. I took a bus back down, and on impulse went to a record store and picked up a 45 RPM record, "It Only Hurts for a Little While," by the Ames brothers. There was a drugstore across the street from the stadium, and the clerks there were very acquainted with me, and I took the record in and asked if I could leave it for someone to pick up in a day or two. When the team arrived in Omaha the next night, I was broke except for the day's $2 meal money. I bought a hamburger and a Coke and put the rest of the money in the payphone. "There's something for you at the drugstore across from the stadium," I told Rosine. "What is it?" she said, in a tone that suggested that she was still uncertain of me. "Just go in and ask for the record Charley Pride left there." My budget didn't allow for another phone call to see if she picked it up, but I was sure she would, and I spent the rest of the trip confident that my little gesture had won her over. How could she refuse to go out with such a clever, thoughtful guy? I was right. Back in Memphis, after several days on the road, I called her and we made plans to go to the movies. After practice on the day of our date, I lay down to take a short nap. Even for young men, it takes a couple of days to recover from a long road trip. I figured on a 2-hour nap, getting up at 6 o'clock and being at Rosine by 7. I slept until nearly 9. Groggy and kicked myself all the way, I stumbled to the payphone and dialed her number. I was awfully tired, I told her. "I understand." Her voice was as frosty as a nickel root beer, about what I had expected. We had our first date a few days later. Rosine had finished high school, attended college and cosmetology school, and had an air of maturity and self-assurance. She came from a home where love and affection were openly expressed. She and her sisters, Pauletta, Hortense, and Irma, were allowed to take part in family discussion and speak their minds without fear of being punished if they disagreed with their father. Ebby Coran was a craftsman, a carpenter, and a landowner. He was well-read and had a lively curiosity about the world. On weekends and vacations, he took his daughters on trips and explored things that farm kids usually only learn about from books. Not necessarily the grand adventures, but small things that expanded their experience and exposure to life beyond the farm. He found interest and education in something as simple as spending an afternoon in Batesville watching the trains come and go. He played with his daughters, had water fights and pillar fights with them, and hugged and praised them. He seldom spanked them and seldom raised his voice. In return, they adored him and were eager to please him. If they needed discipline, he usually could make them see their error by saying nothing more than, "I'm disappointed in you," but he did not overly pamper them. As they grew up, the four had to do their share of work, bringing in the crops, tending the animals, and maintaining the household. They shared his passion for what was then the mostly male domain of professional sports, especially baseball. They knew the teams, the rankings, the players, the starting lineups, utility players, pinch hitters, everyone in both leagues, and their statistics. How often does a guy who lives and breathes baseball meet a woman who loves the game and understands it as well as he? She was smart, beautiful, independent, and could explain the infield fly rule. What else could a guy want? More and more I found myself thinking about Rosine, especially when the team was traveling. Many times when we got back into town, I ran to the telephone, started to dial her number, and stood there trying earnestly to talk myself out of it. This is getting too serious, I thought. Sometimes the conflict was like a storm inside of me. There was one night when the urge to see her was overwhelming, but I was determined not to give in to it. I paced around my room and walked back to the payphone a few times and finally headed for a picture show alone just to keep myself occupied. My mind wasn't on the movie. I sat there and stared at the screen and left the theater without the vaguest idea what I had seen. And walking the streets, I wrestled with my emotion, argued with myself, tried to rationalize my behavior, and finally gritted my teeth and thought, all right, I'll do it. It was a short bus ride to her house. Well, son, her landlady said, she just left to go home down to her mother's in Mississippi. Well, that made me angry with myself, because the team was leaving town the next day and I wouldn't see her for a week or more. I brooded about it the whole trip. When I got back and was with her a few times, the fear returned, and again I looked for reason to avoid her. That went on all summer until the fall, and I was making little progress toward resolving my ambiguous feelings. For a few weeks I didn't see Rosine again. My knuckleball had worked well enough to earn me a spot on the Negro American League All-Star team and a chance to tour around the South playing exhibition games against the Willie Mays All-Stars. November brought greetings from the Selective Service System with instruction to report to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas for basic training with the U.S. Army. It was a second blow that year to my baseball aspiration. Cracking my arm seemed like a minor setback considering how I closed out the season. Coming back from a couple of years in the Army would not be so easy. But the draft noted was a boon to my love life and may also have been a prologue to my professional singing career. Forced to be away from Rosine for a few weeks helped me decide that my feelings for her were not so frightful after all. One night I called and the landlady answered. She isn't here, she said. My first thought was, ooh, who's she with? I felt testy all of a sudden and I guess that bothered me quite a bit. Sitting alone in the barracks late, I told myself, if you're going to be acting like this all the time, you might as well be married. You won't have to worry about who she's with or if she's going out. A month of the basic training, we were given passes to spend Christmas at home. I took a bus to Memphis, saw Rosine, and headed south to Sledge. She went to her parents' home in Oxford, Mississippi. I'm going to get married, I told my dad and my brothers and sisters. No, you're not, Daddy said. You got no business getting married. For once, my brothers and sisters took his side, agreeing with his reasoning that the marriage would fail. What with me being so far away from a lonely, bored wife, and they had heard stories of soldiers and absentee husbands and two-timing wives, and I wasn't swayed. They hadn't met Rosine, and if they did, and I told them, they would have had no such thoughts about her. The argument went on for a couple of days. On December 28th, Daddy's birthday, it came to a head. You get married, go in the Army, and these girls start going out with everybody and doing anything they want to do. And he said, trying once again to dissuade me. I said to him, I want to go over and see her anyway. You going to take me over there? No, I'm not going to take you. Well, I'm going to walk. When he saw that I meant to go, he gave in. Okay, I'll take you. We got in his pickup and drove to Oxford. Rosine's parents didn't object to the marriage. They had raised their daughters to think for themselves and trusted them to make their own decision. Rosine, Hortense, and I drove down to Hernando, a small town just below the Tennessee state line. That was a popular venue for weddings. State laws in Mississippi made it easier to get married there than in Tennessee, where a blood test and waiting period were required. With Hortense as our only witness, we were married in a short civil ceremony. There was not much of a honeymoon. I had only $5 in my pocket, and besides, I had to be back at Fort Chaffee in a couple of days. From our wedding day until early in March, Rosine and I didn't see each other. Late in February, having completed basic training, I was sent to quartermaster school in Fort Carson, Colorado, just outside of Colorado Springs. We talked by phone, wrote letters, and waited to see what kind of living arrangement would be possible. We couldn't afford our own apartment off base, so we eventually made arrangements to share an apartment in Denver with my sister and her husband. They both worked, and with Rosine there, they could have a live-in babysitter. It would be a long commute for me, 70 miles each way, but worth it to be able to be with my wife. She came to Colorado in March. Our half of the apartment rent was $40 a month, which was manageable on $140 a month we were getting from the Army. That spring after quartermaster duty, our company assembled in formation to receive our permanent assignment. The brass had gone through the personnel records and learned that I had played professional baseball before I was drafted. That was enough to rate me a permanent assignment to special service at Fort Carson. Fort Carson had a baseball team, and the competition among various Army posts was serious enough that players were given special consideration, such as getting out of regular duty for practices and games. Our first son, Craig, was born while we were in Colorado, and I felt pressure to start planning our lives after the military. I got word before the end of 1957 that I would not have to serve my full 2 years. There was no war on, and the Army was scaling back. Some officers who had received battlefield commission were busted back to NCOs. Many of us were given tests to determine whether Uncle Sam would keep us. I flunked and was given $100 in the mustering out pay and sent back to civilian life. After 14 months of military service, I had a wife, a child, half an apartment, no car, and no job. Legally, I was still under contract to the Red Sox, but I didn't want to go back to Memphis. Rosina and I liked Colorado, and we had a young child, so staying put would simplify things for us. Bob Howson, who was running the Denver Bears, had indicated he could use me, but not if he had to buy my contract from the Red Sox. I'm going to try to get this release, I told Rosine, but I'm going to have to find a job in the meantime. We got to have a car. She pulled out a big wad of money, and my eyes kind of popped open. Where did you get this? I asked. I've been saving it, she said. From the time we arrived in Colorado, she had been babysitting my sister's kid and my brother-in-law's sister's kids, fixing hair for her friends and putting the money aside. From now on, I said, you're handling all the money. I wrote to the Red Sox owner, Dr. W.S. Martin, and explained my situation. I had a son now, I told him, and a chance to play with the Bears for more money than the Red Sox would pay. Could we please work something out? I wanted a new contract with the more money or a release. I got no reply, which didn't really surprise me. After the major leagues were integrated and began skimming off the top colored talent from the Negro American League, it went into a decline. The owners learned to play contract hardball, to keep their best players, the ones who drew the crowds. They signed them to a long-term contract and refused to sell them except at outrageous prices. Curt Flood had not yet challenged this system with his free agency lawsuit, and therefore the players had little leverage in dealing with the owners, who literally could own you for life. If you wanted to play baseball, you went along with that form of legal slavery. Now, time was getting short. My discharge came through in February. The baseball season would start on the 1st of April, and position would already be filled. I wrote to Martin again, this time sending the letter by certified mail so he could not deny having received it. All I got back was a note acknowledging receipt of my letter. Nothing, though, about my contract. I wrote to Happy Chandler, the Commissioner of Baseball. He replied with a letter certifying that absent a response from the Red Sox owner before April 1, I was free to sign with anyone I chose. By then, it was too late. The Bears had their quota of players. They tried to help me find a job in Bellingham, Washington, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. No more slots for colored players. So I was a free agent, free of the Red Sox, and had no place to go back but to the Red Sox. With the money Rosine had saved and what I had been earning on my job loading shingles, we bought a 51 Chevy and drove to Memphis. I would have to persuade W.S. Martin to take me back. We arrived in Memphis just in time for his funeral. My record with the team had been good enough to give me a little bargaining power, and Martin's brother J.B. even accepted one condition that I was firm about. If a better offer came along, I would be free to negotiate myself and could buy out my contract with the Red Sox. It could be an expensive proposition if he set a high price, but it kept me from being indentured to him. We rented an apartment, and Rosine went back to work at Mrs. Taylor's beauty shop. Later, she took a job in an office that was shared by 2 doctors. It was mostly cleaning work, but it turned out to be a great opportunity for her. She became friends with a woman who worked there as a lab technician, In her spare time, she showed Rosine how the lab equipment worked and taught her how to take and read x-rays. In time, she became a proficient lab technician. That season with the Red Sox went pretty well. Well enough to get me into the East-West All-Star game, and good enough, I thought, to demand more money the next year. $100 a month was not enough for a man with a wife and a child, but J.B. Martin guarded his bank book like a bulldog. Unable to wrangle a raise out of him, I elected to set out the next season. I don't think I had ever heard of Missoula until I saw an advertisement in the Sporting News. The Timberjacks of the Pioneer League were looking for ball players. Write Nick Mariano, general manager, the ad said. So I did, and he wrote back, "Get in as good a shape as you can." He said, "If we sign you, we will reimburse you." The Timberjacks and the other Pioneer League teams were not Major League farm clubs, but they had loose working agreements with the Cincinnati Reds, and in return the Reds had first shot at any Timberjack player they wanted. We were dead broke, and Rosine was probably already fed up with my baseball scheme. She never said anything to discourage me, but from the day she learned I had cracked my arm, she had had doubts about my future in the game. Still, she didn't try to hold me back. We had that kind of relationship from the beginning. Neither one tried to dominate the other or make decisions for the other, and that's the truth. It had to be a test of her patience and good nature, though, and when I told her I was going to hawk the furniture to pay for the trip to Montana, I mortgaged the whole household for $400, gave her half, bought a train ticket with the rest, and hit the road. Missoula is up in the Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountain, one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. Montana was a far cry from the South. It had the kind of free frontier spirit that made anything seem possible, and I fell in love with the state immediately. "I think this is a place where we can make something for ourselves," I wrote to Rosine. The Timberjacks set off on a road trip a few days after I joined them. I got 2 hits and 3 at-bats on that trip, but when we got back to Missoula, Rocky Tedesco, the manager, took me aside and said, "We like the way you run, we like the way you hit. You got 2 for 3, drove in 2 runs. That's $750 all day, Charley, but I'm going to have to let you go." That should have been the end of baseball for me, but something in my head or my heart wouldn't let me believe that I could not make it to the major league. "What do I do now?" I asked Tedesco. I was 23 years old, out of money, out of prospects, and 1,700 miles from my wife and son and mortgaged furniture. He told me about the Montana State League, which was made up of amateur teams sponsored by the various smeltering companies in places like Helena and Anaconda and Butte and Billings. "If you want to work in a smelter," Nick said, "I can probably place you on one of those teams." My options were not exactly abundant. I could make nearly $100 a week and keep playing baseball. "Thanks," I told Nick. "I'd like that." He called someone he knew in Helena, and I had a job with the American Smelting Refining Company and a position on the company baseball team, the East Helena Smelterite. "What are we going to do with the furniture?" Rosine asked when I called to tell her to come to Helena. "It's mortgaged." "Put it in storage," I said. "We'll worry about it later." With what she had learned from her co-worker and doctor employers in Memphis, Rosine was able to get a job as a technician in one of the largest clinics in Helena. In that first spring and summer, I worked days at the smelter and played baseball at night. We had a comfortable lifestyle, better than we had ever had, and we made a lot of friends. There were very few black people in Montana, but we never felt out of place, although at times I found myself trying to explain to people there what the South was like. Montana wasn't just geographically far removed from the South, but the thinking was pretty isolated too. When the sit-ins and boycotts and protest marches began in the South, guys I worked with would ask things like, "What's going on with y'all down there?" That was again the same thing I had grown up with in the segregated South, the same racial division in everyone's mind. Us and them, y'all and us. There was no physical segregation in Helena, but the mental partition were unavoidable. While I played for them, the East Helena Smelterites won the Montana State League Championship 4 times. Maybe if I had bombed in that league, I would have put aside my baseball fantasies then and there, but in my first season I hit .444 and carefully clipped all the newspaper articles from the portfolio I would present to the major leagues. Before games, I used to sing the national anthem over the PA and, if time permitted, tack on a country tune or two. After games, the team usually went to a bar in East Helena to celebrate and unwind with a beer and a bull session. A lot of those joints had small bandstands or an area set aside for live entertainment. If there was an idle guitar around, my teammates would encourage me to pick and sing a little. Before long, they were passing the hat among the patrons, and it wasn't unusual to collect several dollars in tips. One night I got a call from a guy who identified himself as a union secretary. "I understand you've been singing in bars," he said. "Are you a member of the Musicians Union?" I had never heard of such an organization. "No, why?" I said. "You have to join if you're going to sing professionally." That's what he said. My first thought was that somebody was trying to keep the colored guy in his place, scare him with some phony union talk. "How much does it cost?" I asked. "The initiation fee is $40. The annual dues are $20. $40? I don't have $40. "I don't think I'll join," I told him. "Then you can't sing," he insisted. Later I checked around and confirmed that there actually was a musician union. Because I was only singing for tips, it didn't make sense to join, not at those dues. But I couldn't defy a union either. I continued to sing in bars after ball games. But we stopped passing the hat, and I was an unpaid amateur again and outside the union's jurisdiction. I was working the 3 to 11 shift at the smelter, and when my foreman told me that the owner of a place called the White Mill Bar in Helena had heard about me from my landlady and wanted to talk to me about a singing job, he asked me if I would let you off on Thursday night so he could give you a tryout, the foreman said. I told him I would. On Thursday night, I walked into the White Mill about 7 o'clock, and the place was already crowded, as was usually the case with Montana Saloon. The White Mill Bar was noisy, boisterous, and blue-collar, all white and country to the core. I could feel the stares and hear the noise level shift when I walked across the floor, set up my equipment in a corner, and began tuning the guitar. But I felt then, and still do, that the undertone was one of the curiosity about how or what I might sing rather than about my color. It was unlikely that anyone there had ever heard a black person sing country music, and they probably figured that they were in for a night of rhythm and blues. "I'm a Hank Williams fan," I said, "and when the guitar was tuned and ready, I'd like to do one of his songs for you. Hope you enjoy it." That brought polite applause, but when I finished, the crowd really warmed up. They weren't just polite, they were downright enthusiastic. I performed there free a few times, and things sort of snowballed after that. The owner of the main tavern downtown called. "I'll give you $20 a night to sing at my place 2 nights a week," he said. $20 was as much money as I'd made on a full shift at the smelter. I decided to join the musician union after all. I also bought a guitar and amplifier and microphone. Word about the black country singing in Helena spread around fairly quickly, and Johnny Walker, who owned the corner bar over in Anaconda, he bidded the price of my services up to $40 a night. Anaconda was 80 miles from Helena, but it only cost $5 for gas to make the round trip. I took the job and kept it for 2.5 years. During the off-season, I put together newspaper clippings from my Red Sox and Smelterite exploits and mailed them with a letter of introduction to several Major League teams. That year was the beginning of a period of expansion in Major League Baseball, and that meant more jobs, especially for black players, because the quota system was loosening a little bit. The National League was founded in 1876 and the American League in 1901. Each had 8 teams at the beginning and remained at that level until 1961. The American League expanded first, adding the Los Angeles Angels and the Washington Senators, which later became the Texas Rangers. Gene Autry, who owned the Angels, had made a lot of money as a singing cowboy actor, and he invested it wisely in hotel chains and music publishing and a chain of radio and television stations. One of his radio stations in Southern California, KMPC, had tried to get the contract to broadcast the Los Angeles Dodger games and failed. So Autry teamed up with a guy named Bob Reynolds and went after and won the Los Angeles franchise in the American League expansion. Since the new team did not have established lineups, they were more receptive to free agents. I sent my portfolio to Fred Haney, the general manager of the Angels, and got a reply from Bill Rigney, the manager. The Angels would begin spring training in Palm Springs, California on March 1, and if I could be there, I would have a tryout. No small risk was involved. Because I did not have enough accumulated vacation time, I would have to take a leave of absence from my job, and the Angels would not pay my travel and expenses. The trip would make a big dent in our savings. Rosine wasn't confident that I would make the team, but she did not tell me that. As usual, she accepted my decision, not wanting me to feel later that she had held me back or stood between me and something so important to me. It was a short trial. My pitching arm was sore a lot during that camp, probably from trying too hard to impress Marv Grissom, the pitching coach. At the end of 2 weeks, Grissom took me aside and said, "Charley, you just don't have a major league pitching arm. We're going to have to let you go." For the rest of that year, I settled back into my routine. I kept my job with the Anaconda Company in Helena, rejoined the Smelterites, and made the drive down to the corner bar 2 nights a week. Financially, we were doing well. With Rosine's job and my 2, our income was getting close to $10,000 a year. She became pregnant with our second child, and we moved into a larger apartment. Early in 1962, I was preparing for a run at one of the new National League teams when spring training opened. The choice was between the Houston Astros and the New York Mets, and I chose the Mets. George Weiss, a well-respected baseball executive, had gone over from the New York Yankees as general manager and had brought Casey Stengel out of retirement to run the team. Anybody would have coveted a chance to play for Casey Stengel. If I could not get invited to the Mets camp, I would show up anyway. Once again, fate scowled at me. At the smelter one night, that winter, a slag truck ran over my ankle and broke it, not only preventing me from going to the Mets camp, but knocking me out of a big chunk of the Smelterite season. Rosine gave birth to our second son, Dion. That year, and more, we began to think of Montana as our home. We were happy there. We talked about buying a house and looked at a few in our spare time. Within a few months, my ankle had healed well enough for me to join the Smelter team, and we won the Copper League championship for the 3rd straight year. We might have settled in Montana permanently had it not been for Tiny Stokes, a local disc jockey, and his friendship with a country singer by the name of Webb Pierce, who was coming to Helena to do a show with Red Savine. "I've got it all set up for you to audition for Webb," Tiny told me over the telephone. Audition for Webb Pierce, one of the biggest stars in the business. Red Savine, the man who had made truck driving songs a mainstay of country music, would also be there. I could not have asked for a more important audience. Something occurred to me. When the singers came into town for a show, they usually went down to the radio station and spent some time on the air, talking with the local DJ and promoting the show. Sure enough, when I walked into the studio, they were just coming from behind the microphone. Only Webb Pierce wasn't there. Red Foley had taken his place. But that was just as good. Red Foley had been on top in country music throughout the 1940s and 1950s, and some of his songs had become classics. He was something of a patriarch, an elder statesman, if not a godfather of the business. Tiny introduced me to him first. "Red," he said, "this is Charley Pride. He's a country music singer." I extended my hand and said, "Hello, Mr. Foley." He looked at me warily and asked, "Is this something pertaining to civil rights?" Before I could answer, Tiny spoke up. No, this guy is for real. I want you to hear him. It's got nothing to do with civil rights. He sings locally here." Foley said, "I see," shook my hand, and walked away. "Tell you what," Tiny said, "come to the show, and I'll get them to listen to you during the intermission. I'll give you a signal to come backstage." That evening, I put on a pair of casual trousers and a jacket, drove to the theater, and like everyone else, I paid my $1.50 admission. Tiny was the MC, and he came out holding a piece of paper. He said he had received a telegram informing him that Webb Pierce was unable to appear and that Red Foley would perform in his play. I must have sat there an hour or more watching the show and waiting for the signal. What if it doesn't come? What if there's no signal? I kept thinking, Foley had not seemed exactly overjoyed at our introduction. Well, I wasn't going to get dressed up and lay out $1.50 for nothing, so I got up and invited myself backstage. I hung around waiting for the intermission. When it finally arrived, I introduced myself to the musicians and got each one of them to sign my program. Then I picked up a guitar and started strumming it. It sounds strange because it wasn't tuned for the way I played a guitar, and everyone was looking at one another, no doubt wondering who this character was. When I had it tuned for the open bar chords, it sounded much better. "Can I sing now?" I asked. Nobody said anything, so I sang Heartaches by the Numbers, a song that had been a hit for Ray Price, and a Hank Williams standard, Lovesick Blues. The producer heard me and came a little closer. Foley and Savine also were attentive. When I finished, Foley looked at Savine and said, "Man, that's different." Savine smiled at me and said, "I don't believe it. You ought to go to Nashville. I don't care what color you are." The producer apparently liked my singing too. "Would you like to be on the second half of the show?" he said. Near the end of the show, I was brought on stage, and I don't recall how many people were in the audience that night, but it was easily the largest crowd I'd ever appeared before, and it was the first time I had performed with a full band backing me up. Going on that stage was a big moment for me, a small-time saloon singer with Red Savine and Red Foley. The importance of it, whether it would broaden my singing career or increase my fees in local bars, or whether it mattered at all, wasn't clear to me, but I felt that buying a ticket to that show was the best $1.50 I ever spent. Afterward, Red Savine and I talked some more. He was more congenial toward me than Foley was, and I had an immediate fondness for him. "You should go to Nashville," he told me again. "Go to Cedarwood Publishing and tell them I sent you. They're a big outfit. They do my bookings, Webb Pierce, and lots of others." He gave me his phone number and told me to call him if I needed help. I thanked him and asked him to sign the program. Being rejected by the Angels had affected me more than I wanted to admit. I had seen good players that sprang and was confident that I could play at their level. In the months after returning from California, I often felt overwhelmed by frustration and futility. The prospect of working the rest of my life over a cauldron of molten ore became very real. My daily routine, a full shift on my day job, and a long night of singing in saloon for the few extra dollars it took to stay even. Getting home a lot of mornings just as Rosine was going to work had become fatiguing. I came home from the night shift, and soot and dirt were caked on my face and hands and clothes. There was nothing unusual about that, but it had never really bothered me. For some reason that morning, the grime felt like a terrible disease. Rosine fixed breakfast and sat down to talk. Before she had to leave, I looked at my clothes and at her and started to cry. "I'm better than this," I said, pounding a fist on the table. "One of these days I'm going to show you. You're going to have a nice home and you won't have to work. You're going to drive down the street and people are going to say, 'There goes Miss Pride.'" It must have sounded like overwrought babbling to her just as it did to me, but she said nothing except to cheer me up. A few weeks later, Rosine saw me getting old newspaper clippings together. "What are you going to do, Pride?" "We've got a little money saved," I said. "I'm going to give it one more shot." Having passed my mid-20s, I was sliding into the twilight time of professional athletes. In those days, if you weren't established in the Major League by the time you were 25 years old, you could forget it. The ankle bone had healed, but still bothered me. It wasn't painful, just stiff. And I couldn't run at full speed, but I could still throw and hit, and there was one team in the majors that could use both talents. Except for the broken ankle, I would have knocked on the Mets' door in 1962, but after watching that team through its first season, I was even more encouraged. In that first season, they lost 120 games and finished 60.5 out of first place. One of the worst showings in Major League history. That team was managed by Casey Stengel, who had run the Yankees for 12 years and accomplished things that may never be equaled. The Yankees won the World Series 7 times during his tenure and won the American League pennant 10 times. But poor Casey, the old professor, as he was called, was saddled with veterans trying to squeeze one more year out of the game and rookies still trying to learn the sign. Surely I could get a shot with the worst team in the country. I mailed the clippings to George Weiss, the general manager, telling him I would be in Clearwater, Florida for spring training camp, and I ordered 6 Louisville Slugger bats, the W166 Brooks Robertson model, with my name engraved on them. I shipped the bats so they would arrive at the camp a few days ahead of me. I made arrangements at the smelter to use some vacation days and bought a one-way ticket to Florida. It was all we could afford. Before leaving, I sent a telegram to Weiss and Stengel informing them when I would arrive. My flight arrived in Tampa well past midnight. I had no idea where to go. I took a cab and with help from the driver managed to locate the hotel. By then it was like 4 a.m. I approached the counter and announced I'm here to join the Mets. The clerk looked at me suspiciously and said, "Are you with the team?" I said, "Well, sort of." I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want to be bounced out either. "Well, we don't have any rooms. Is anybody sleeping single?" I asked. The registration book was open on the counter. I studied the names. One stood out, Sammy Drake. Sammy was a second baseman who had played for the Chicago Cubs a couple of years earlier. I had met him while I was in the Angels training camp, and we had a talk a couple of times and had played against each other in an exhibition game, but we were not exactly buddies. "That's my buddy," I said. "I can bunk with him." The clerk took me up to Sammy's room, and I knocked on the door, and there was no answer. I knocked again, the door opened, and that was Sammy in his underwear, half asleep and rubbing his eyes, and he squinted at me for a second. "Charley," he said, "come on in." We talked for a while, and Sammy went back to bed. I stretched out on the floor to grab a few hours of sleep, and tomorrow I would meet the legendary Casey Stengel. The press loved Stengel for his antics, but also for the colorful way he spoke. The writers called it Stingalese, I believe. While he was managing the Yankees, he announced one year that he would quit if the season went badly. It did, but Casey stayed on. "You said you had made up your mind to quit," a sports writer reminded him. "I made up my mind, but I made it up both ways." That's what Casey said. There he was, striding down the hall toward me, and less imposing than his legend, but still larger than life. My mouth felt dry, and butterflies the size of wild turkeys fluttered around in my stomach. "Mr. Stengel," I said, starting to extend my hand, "I'm Charley Pride, and—" "We'll be going out to the ballpark in a few minutes," he growled and brushed past me. He did. When I got to the lobby, there was a ruckus at the desk. Someone was speaking in a loud voice to the clerk I had met earlier that morning. "You just let anybody come in here off the street," and the voice was saying, "and it belongs to a guy who, I was told later, was the Mets secretary." "Sir, it wasn't his fault," I interrupted. "You be quiet." He turned to me and glared, "and if I want you to explain, I'll let you know. I'll talk to you later." Hardly a word was spoken all the way to the park. Casey Stengel, George Weiss, and a guy named Johnson, the Mets minor league director, were standing by the third base fence when we arrived. "We ain't running no damn tryout camps," I heard Casey say. Johnson tried to speak up for me. "Well, he sent his clippings, and he said—" "I'm not going to look at him," Casey interjected. "If you want to look at him, take him down here to one of these pastures and look at him. I'm not running any tryout camps down here." They were hell-bent against giving me a tryout, and there was nothing I could do about it. This was the bunch that had lost 120 games, and they wouldn't even look at a guy who had doubled off a Warren Spahn and struck out Ernie Banks. I was hurt, angry, humiliated, and devastated. I gathered up my bats and started back to the bus. "I called Rosine. I'm taking the bus home," I said, "but don't expect me too soon. I'm stopping off in Nashville." 2 men were standing in the reception area when I walked in, Cedarwood Publishing. Tired and rumpled from travel, they looked at me and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "Red Savine told me to come by here. I met him up in Montana. When a black man showed up at a business office, no one could be sure if he was there to sweep it or sit in it. Can we help?" one of the men said. It was Bill Denny, the owner of Cedarwood. I managed to find a few words. "Mr. Sovine told me to come here. I met him up in Montana. I'm a country singer." They said, "Oh," and looked at each other. Walking across the back of the room was someone I recognized. He went into an office. "Is that Webb Pierce?" I asked. "Yeah," Denny said. Can I meet him? Pierce was a big stick in Nashville, surely too big to have strangers just off the bus walking through his door and taking up his time. Sure, go ahead, then, he said. It was almost as if they had been expecting me. Pierce was behind a desk, leaning back in a large swivel chair. I walked straight towards him, extended my hand, and introduced myself. I'm from Montana, I said. You were supposed to have been on a show up there last year in Helena. Oh, yes, Red Foley filled in for me that day. I want to make a tape. I'm a country singer, and I said, there's this DJ up in Montana. Well, he had it all set up for me to sing for you. He grabbed that line like it had a fish on the end of it, and son, I do my own singing, he said. I mean, audition for you. He smiled, stood up slowly, walked to the door, and summoned one of the men I had talked to earlier. Get this boy a guitar and take him downstairs, he said. The downstairs room was an austere place with chairs, lockers, and tape recorders, and a few guitars. Jack Johnson came in, introduced himself, and we shook hands. You Aubrey's boy, he asked? Jack Johnson had been looking for a black country singer. It wasn't an easy assignment. For one thing, there weren't many. For another, the segregation that existed in those days made it tough for someone like Johnson to locate and scout black artists. He wasn't likely to hang around black clubs waiting for a hillbilly singer to show up. He had talked to a rock singer by the name of Aubrey Wilson and told him, if you ever run across a colored guy who sings real country music, send him to me. Aubrey Wilson didn't send you? Jack asked. I shook my head. Well, they tell me you sing country music, he said, so sing some country music for me. He turned on a tape recorder. I sang Heartaches by the Number. Okay, sing another one, he said. When I finished, Johnson said, pretty good. Now sing in your natural voice. What do you mean? I said. This is my natural voice. He shrugged. Sing another one. I did, put the guitar aside, and we talked. He wanted to know where I was from and how I happened to wander into Cedarwood. Well, I told him about Tiny Stokes, the DJ, and Red Savine and Red Foley show, and about the saloon singing I had done in Montana. And he said, I think I can do something for you. He paused for a second and then added, but we might have to change your name to something like George Washington W. Jones III or something like that. Hold it, I said. There ain't going to be no name change. My name is Charley Frank Pride. It's been good enough since I've been in this world, and I don't see any reason to change it. We'll talk about it later, he said, abruptly changing the subject. How long are you going to be in town? I'm in no hurry to leave. I'm on vacation since I'm here, and I intend to meet everybody in Nashville that I can. Fella, he said, you've met everybody here you need to meet. I'm going to be your manager. You go home, and I'll send a contract for you to sign. I'll start trying to find you a record label. The contract was waiting at home when I got back to Montana. There I was with an 11th grade education, trying to figure it out. One part that was clear was the clause that said Jack Johnson would get 25% of everything I made. 25%? I wanted to talk to somebody who understood those things, and I called Red Savine in Nashville. Red, I've got this manager's contract here, and it's got a lot of stuff in it I don't understand. Well, Charlie, you ain't going to need no... Wait a minute. He said, you're probably going to need a manager. And he said, I kind of manage myself, and I'm thinking about myself. But let me ask you this. He said, I know that seems like a lot, but let me ask you something. How much are you making right now? Well, and I told him about $6,500 a year. Well, what do you think about $75,000 or $100,000 next year? Doesn't 75% of $100,000 sound pretty good? It sounded good. Charlie, take that to a lawyer and let him explain it to you, he said, but don't forget, 75% of something is better than 100% of nothing. I signed and mailed the contract back to Jack Johnson. From time to time, I called Jack Johnson to check on his progress toward the recording contract. Be patient, he would say. I'm working on it. It's just going to take a little time. How much time? The months were turning into years, and I was growing impatient. He had no answer. By the summer of 1965, we had 3 children. Our daughter Angela had just been born, and our families had not seen her. We planned to spend our vacation that year in Mississippi. But I was also going to use the trip to try to make something happen in Nashville. Before leaving Montana, I called my manager. I'm going through Nashville, I told him, and I'd like to get moving with this thing. "It's been 2 years now, Jack," and I said, pushing him just a little. "Well, come on by," he said. In the meantime, Johnson got in touch with a producer named Jack Clement, and they came up with 7 songs. "When you learn them," Johnson told me when I got to Nashville, "make a tape of them and mail it to us." He had taken the recording I had made at Cedarwood in 1953 all over town and was meeting a fair amount of resistance from the record labels. What was happening, Jack told me, was that he would play my songs for recording company executives and they would respond favorably, sometimes enthusiastically. But when he showed them my picture, the reaction was usually the same. "Who are you going to sell these records to? Are the DJs going to play them? We'll have to think about it." I took the songs and drove to Rosine's parents' house in Oxford, Mississippi, where I holed up in the bedroom to rehearse them. After 2 or 3 days, I was confident enough to call Jack Johnson and tell him I had them down pat. I also informed him that I was not going to mail the tape. I would return to Nashville and rehearse them in front of them, in their presence. "Okay," he said. I drove back to Nashville myself and met them in Clement's office. Accompanied by Clement on a guitar, I sang each of the songs. Clement looked at Johnson and said, "Jack, I think he's ready." He told me he had reserved a studio at RCA for 2 o'clock on August 16th to do some recording of his own. "Do you think you could record 2 songs in 3 hours?" I said, "I can do it in 1, I said. "Can you be back here on the 16th, he said. "RCA Studio B. That would be 2 days later. "I'll be here," I said. Wednesday morning, I got up early and drove to Nashville. After meeting the studio technician, becoming familiar with the equipment, and going through the material with the musicians a couple of times, I recorded Snakes Crawl at Night. Mel Tillis, who wrote the song, happened to be walking through the studio, and from a story I heard later, was a little astonished to hear his words being sung by a black singer. I also recorded another Mel song's Atlantic Coastal Line. It was a short session, easier than I had imagined it would be. Jack Johnson gave me a copy of the recording, and I left town. Jack Johnson now had the dubs of a real studio session to shop around, and he had help from Jack Clement. Clement took the tapes to Chet Atkins, probably the best guitar player who ever lived. In tandem with his music career, Chet was also a rising executive with RCA. It was Chet Atkins who brought to RCA people such as Floyd Kramer, Connie Smith, and Don Gibson, Waylon Jennings, and Bobby Bare. He had personally supervised the recordings of Elvis Presley, Eddie Arnold, Perry Como, Jerry Reed, Al Hurt, and others. Those successes gave him a lot of influence with the bigwigs at RCA. Chet took my tapes to Monterey, California, and played them for the executives out there. He was confident that they would like what they heard. They did. "Wait a minute now," Chet said. "I need to tell you something. He's colored." Some eyebrows were raised and a few feet shuffled, but Chet lobbied hard for RCA to take a chance on me. Before the meeting was over, the others were sold. Their strategy was cautious. They would put out a record and let it speak for itself. Nothing would be said about my race, at least not in the beginning. Jack Clement became my producer, and he told me my first single, Snakes Crawl at Night, with Atlantic Coastal Line on the flip side, would be the release just after Christmas. For a long time, considerable care would be exercised in the selecting of my song. Snakes didn't set off any alarms because it's about a guy who shot his wife, and there was a certain racial neutrality to it. A love song was different. A white guy might ask, "Wait a minute, who's he singing this to?" He's singing to our women. There was one particular song where that issue came up early in my career. There's a line that goes, "In the green, green grass of home, down the road I look and there runs Mary, hair of gold and lips like cherries." A black man singing about a blonde girlfriend with potential trouble. Bert Kane was my supervisor at the smelter, and I could not have asked for a more understanding and accommodating boss. After Snakes came out and was doing pretty well, I had to make other trips to Nashville for recording session. There were other singles to do, and we had started work on an album. Bert always gave me a leave of absence when it was necessary, and he always welcomed me back. As time passed, though, the absences became longer. I was getting more offers to sing in clubs, and I could draw bigger crowds and command a higher paycheck. Sometime in the summer of 1966, I went to Bert Kane again to ask to be off work. He and I both had a feeling, I think, that it would be my last leave of absence. My second single, Before I Met You, was released. It wasn't until Just Between You and Me was released and started climbing the charts that I began to sense a permanence about what I was doing. That song was big enough that it promised a friendly financial reward, but more important, it got me into the major leagues. A few months after it was released, I was driving to Detroit to play with the Merle Haggard and Buck Owens and Red Foley show. If I believe the Detroit concert had settled the question of whether I would be accepted in country music, I was wrong. Winning the approval of audiences was one thing, getting a break from the club owners and promoters was another. There was a place in Chicago called the Club Rivoli, owned by an Italian guy named Sammy C., who had built it into one of those prestigious stops that could be a generous boost to the career of someone still trying to get a toehold in the singing business. Playing there meant you were on your way. Jack Johnson spent a lot of time trying to book me there, but Sammy was a hard sell. At that point in the civil rights movement, major cities, not just those in the South, were edgy about protests and sit-ins and the possibility of violence. Nobody wanted to be a part of something that might touch off a disturbance. After spending an hour on the phone with Sammy and not getting anywhere, Jack said, "Look, why don't you at least talk to Charley?" "Fine," Sammy said, "I'll do that." My approach to him was something less than aggressive. I had no interest in being party to a racial incident and told him so. "My manager says you're not sure you want to get involved at this early stage of my career." That's what I said. "Well, yes, something like that," he said. "I can understand how you could feel that way," I said. "I'm not even off the ground yet, and I don't want anything to happen to hurt my career at this point either. You think it's the wrong time, I understand." He apparently was not expecting me to be so agreeable. "Tell you what," he said, "you didn't call up here making demands or creating some big rigmarole, so I'm going to book you for Friday and Saturday night, but I'm not going to advertise you." "How do you expect to bring anybody in?" I asked. "The club seats about 800, and with no advertising I could find myself singing to empty chairs." He says to me, "I send out 1,000 or 2 flyers to my regular customers, telling them who's appearing here each weekend. I'll handle it like that," he said. Jack and I agreed it was worth the gamble. If nobody showed, we hadn't lost much. If 800 showed and half walked out, it would be just another setback and we'd have to overcome later. If we went over big, other doors should start to open. On Friday night, we had maybe 80 people. Sammy paced the bar like an expectant father. Finally, the announcer brought me on, and you could feel the shock in the room. After a couple of songs, the crowd, if it could be called that, loosened up, and we had a good time. The next night, we had 800 people, including 2 of the biggest promoters in country music, Smokey Smith from Des Moines and Lucky Moeller from Nashville. They were watching the audience reaction. From the stage, I could see them sitting there with their heads together and comparing notes, and Smokey later booked a lot of shows for me. Those early years amounted to a series of tests. Okay, we passed Dallas. Would they accept me in Atlanta? We played Atlanta, no problem. How about Houston? It went on, and each time I passed the test, sometimes in ways that surprised me. I did a show in Texarkana which straddles the Texas-Arkansas line, and I had been told that it was not the most enlightened place in America. Just as I was getting ready to go on, a guy walked up to me and said, "I'm the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan here." Before I could even swallow hard, his arm shot out, and he said, "I just want to shake the hands with a man." I shook his hand and stood there a little confounded while he walked back to his table. He just as easily could have said, "I'm here with the tar and feathers." But he sat down, stayed for the whole show, and seemed to enjoy it. After finishing my first show in Atlanta, someone came to the stage and told me one of the patrons wanted me to come to his table. "Charley," the guy said in a pronounced Southern accent, "that was a good show. I'm from way down in Georgia, and I'll be darned, I ain't never heard a nigger sound like you in all my life. You put on a hell of a show." Should I have been offended or flattered? There wasn't a trace of malice in his voice. He was as sincere and affable as anyone could be. Nigger was just a natural part of his vernacular, I suppose, and its use implied nothing. I was coming to realize that many people, particularly Southerners, weren't aware that there was any other way to refer to a person of African descent. I didn't set out to be a crusader for racial harmony or change anybody's heart or mind, but I learned early that, well, you can accomplish more with tolerance than with indignation. And one way or another, the color issue was always there. I had to find ways to deal with it. And the problems were not just with white audience. On my first USO tour in Germany, I was mildly heckled by black soldiers because I sang country music. It was as though someone had built a fence down the middle of the room. All the black soldiers was on one side and all the whites on the other. Of course, that's the way most of them had lived back home, with an imaginary barrier separating the two of them. One night I got a few cat calls from the black side of the room, and I had sung a few country songs, and there was some snickering, and someone yelled out, "When are you going to do one for us brothers?" It was time to clear the air. I stopped the show and said, "It looks like we're going to have a question and answer session here." "What was the question?" "When are you going to sing one for us brothers?" the guy yelled. "I'm singing for my brothers on this side of the room and for my brothers on this side of the room." That's what I said. I told you in the beginning, I'm not James Brown, I'm not Sam Cooke. I'm Charley Pride, country singer. I'm just me, and that's what you get. There was some laughter and foot shuffling, but things settled down and we finished the show. It would have served no purpose to pretend to be someone I wasn't and perform two shows, one for each side of the room. That would only have fortified the air of separation that already existed in that place. It was on that same tour that I experienced one of the most poignant moments of those years of confronting the race issue, of trying to find my place in the white world of country music. We performed an outdoor show at an army post. Afterwards, I sat at a table in front of the stage signing autographs and talking to the soldiers. I noticed one young man who seemed to be hanging back, as though waiting for the others to leave before he would approach me. When everyone else had gone, he came over to talk privately. He told me he was from Alabama. "I came out here to see you make a fool of yourself, but you didn't," he said. "You did Hank Williams and Ray Price's songs, and about as good as they do them themselves, maybe even better." I wasn't sure where this was leading, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. He had something to say, and it spilled out of him. He was having second thoughts, he said, about the things he had been taught by his parents and the segregated environment back home, things he had always believed. But in the Army, he had befriended black soldiers, and apparently watching my show had intensified his doubts. "My parents taught me that black people were under me, inferior or something," he stammered. Tears formed in his eyes, and "It's not just you," I said. "That's been going on for a long time in a lot of places." He said, "What am I going to say to my parents?" "You have to believe what your parents tell you," he said. "You're supposed to love your parents." I don't think I really believe what I was taught anymore. I just wanted to tell you that. "Well, you have to make your own decision," I told him, and we shook hands and he left. I've often wished I had not forgotten his name. It would be interesting to learn where life had taken him. This is as good a time as any to set the record straight about the bomb scare in Augusta, Maine. It has been reported from time to time that I was the target of a bomb threat by racist elements up there, and I have never been convinced of that. We arrived in Augusta to do a show at 7:30. I was waiting in a little room backstage. Usually someone alerted me about 10 minutes before I was to go on. 7:30 passed, 7:40 passed. I was getting restless, but had heard from no one. I could hear noises in the theater, feet stomping and shuffling. About 7:45, someone came to the door. "Charley, let me tell you what's wrong. We got a call, and everybody's in the manager's office." I walked down to that office, where several people were trying to decide whether to proceed with the show. They told me that an anonymous call had been received warning that a bomb would go off in the theater at 9 o'clock. There was general agreement that the call was a hoax, but nobody could be certain. Still, the majority wanted to proceed as though nothing had happened. Let me tell you what we're going to do, I said. I'm going to go out and tell them what the situation is and let them decide what kind of chance they want to take. I walked straight from the manager's office to the stage. Scattered applause rippled across the room, but I waved my hand to ask for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got to announce something. We received a call, a bomb threat for 9 o'clock. Immediately, people started getting out of their seats. I personally don't believe anything is going to happen, I said, but I was supposed to start the show at 7:30. Let's all take our time and clear the building. At exactly 1 minute past 9, I will come back on this stage and give you the same show you were going to see at 7:30. The police searched the building and found nothing. Just after 9, people returned to the theater. We lost only about 300 out of 7,000 people, which I thought was pretty good. The show went on without incident. I have always been convinced that the threat had nothing to do with me except that I happened to be appearing there that night. For several weeks before I had arrived, Augusta had been the scene in a nasty protest over increased electricity rates. Some people were so angry that they had been knocking out power stations, transformers, and generators that belonged to the local utility company. A full theater, no matter who was performing, was a convenient venue for furthering the protest. There was another time when it was reported that a gunshot was fired as I was leaving a theater in Minneapolis. I never had any proof that it was a gunshot. It may have been a car backfiring. But the police came to the theater and cleared the parking lot before allowing me to leave. I tried not to let such things concern me, but episodes like those in Augusta and Minneapolis and whatever rumors grew from them may have had a detrimental effect. They were precisely the kinds of incidents club owners and promoters fear most. On one of my visits to Nashville, Jack Johnson said, "There are a few guys you're going to have to get by before you're accepted in this town. One of them is Farron Young." What's he like? I had heard Hello Walls and Live Fast, Love Hard, and Die Young, and Wind Me Up, and a lot of Farron's other songs, too. I was aware that he was a major figure in the country music establishment and had started out in 1953 on the Louisiana Hayride, which was broadcast from his hometown of Shreveport. He was involved in other things besides singing. He was part owner of an automobile racetrack in Sulphurdale in Nashville and was connected with a monthly newspaper called the Music City News. And I think he had been in a few movies. There's no telling what he's going to say, Jack Johnson said, and explaining Farron's reputation for being something of a redneck, outspoken, and just a shade on the profane side. He might just walk up and call you anything. Just be prepared. Fine, I said. I'm glad you told me. I had come to Nashville to cut my first album, Country Charley Pride, on the heels of a disastrous package tour of Montana with Carl Ballou and Johnny Paycheck, Karen Kelly, and Johnny Darrell. We didn't draw flies. We were all newcomers and not well known. I headed to Nashville in hopes of hooking up with more established performers for a more successful tour. My career had reached a point where the issue of who would or wouldn't work with me had to be addressed. Farron Young was one of the big boys, and Jack and I had been told that he had said he wouldn't work with me, that he wouldn't jeopardize his career that way. We went by his office, and he wasn't there. We looked all over town for him and made a swing by a club he frequented. He was there. When we walked in, Farron was sitting in a chair with his back to the door. He had a microphone in his hand and was bent over a tape recorder talking a mile a minute. Not inclined toward shyness anyway, and especially not at a time like this, I walked right up behind him and said, "Hi, Farron." He stiffened, hunched up his shoulders, and cut his eyes toward me, and he seemed to be thinking of what he was going to say, and I braced for the worst. "Hello, Charley," he said, standing up to face me. "You sing a good song." I said, "Thank you, Farron," and I said, "You do too." We all sat down and talked for a while, and the conversation was relaxed and pleasant. There was a guitar nearby, and Farron picked it up and started singing. After a couple of songs, I joined in with him. That went on for about 10 or 15 minutes before Farron looked over at Jack with a big grin on his face. "Hot damn, here I am singing with a jig, and I don't even mind it," he said. "Who'd ever have thought of it?" I guess he expected me to throw a punch or something, but I was waiting for something like that, I said. "You were?" I said, "Yeah." Guess what I was going to say if you had said something really bad. "What?" "I was going to say, you little puckered-mouthed banty rooster peckerwood." He blinked. "You were going to say that to me?" Just like that. I'll be damned. Within a few weeks, we were on tour together. He was one of my best supporters in the early days, and that helped break some ground for me. And I want to tell you, when someone who is considered a die-hard redneck stands beside a black man and says, "Hey, I like this guy," it disarms people who might have been reluctant to associate with it. We had some good times together, and I've always appreciated what Farron did for me. Some people are able to put their separatist notions aside quicker than others, and he was one of them. Gradually, I was getting past the influential people in Nashville. The next one I had to test was a prolific young songwriter and rising singer named Willie Nelson. I was not personally involved in the planning and negotiation of the tour I'm about to mention, which now has come to be remembered as the Willie Nelson Tour. We would be working some hardcore segregationist turf, Texas and Louisiana. Originally, it was a tour that Crash Stewart was putting together for Ray Price, and he was in Nashville looking for some other acts to fill out the package. For some reason, Ray had to back out, and Willie persuaded Stewart to make him the headliner instead. To round out the program, a guy named Billy Deaton proposed hiring me. He liked my singing, and at that time I did not yet command a high fee. As Willie has told it, he was reluctant purely for monetary reasons to go along with the plan. "It's too big a risk," he told Crash. "We could piss a lot of people off and lose a lot of money." But Crash argued with Willie, and to convince him, played one of my songs for him. It was Snakes Crawl at Night. Willie liked it and said, "Okay, put him on the show." That tour with Willie opened some doors, partly because it dispelled a lot of anxieties about the race factor, proved that trouble didn't follow Charley Pride. Willie even began to flaunt it. We had a stop in San Antonio, and we were all staying at the Roadway Inn. Jack and I drove up, and there was a lot of people standing in front of the motel. Willie was there, along with some of the band members and a group of fans. As I got out of the car, I heard Willie yell, "Hey, super nigger, come over here." As I walked towards him, everyone looked around nervously, maybe thinking there was going to be trouble. When I got to where Willie was standing, he grabbed me and kissed me with the whole crowd looking on. That broke everybody up. Willie called me super nigger for a long time after that. I think it was his way of disarming any racist who might be around, a way of taking the language out of, well, the rancor and throwing it back at them as humor, the way Red Fox often did. In the same way that profanity is enfeebled by overuse. The buzzwords of hate can be neutralized by mocking them. For most entertainers, I believe there's a single experience, one defining moment when confidence replaces self-doubt, that most of us wrestle with early in our careers. For me, that happened on an autumn day in Phoenix, Arizona, when I was asked to substitute for Jimmy Durante at the State Fair show. A series of performers was booked for the fair, and one for each day. I had played before about 17,000 people, and Jack Johnson and I were getting ready to leave town the next day. We got a call from Rex Allen, who was emceeing the shows. Jimmy Durante had done his first show but fell and hurt his head and was unable to keep his second engagement. "Would you consider doing 30 minutes for the old man?" he asked. I was flattered, but a little uneasy about it, too. The people who had bought tickets to my show came to hear country music. Those who had paid to see Jimmy Durante was expecting something else, but Rex was very persuasive. We accepted. Rex explained to the audience about Jimmy Durante's accident and how Charley Pride had kindly consented to substitute for him. I walked on stage, and ladies and gentlemen, a lot of you probably have never heard of me, but I'm happy to fill in for Mr. Durante. Here's a song from my first album. I hope you enjoy it. I introduced each song by saying, "Here's one from my second album. Here's one from my third album." I only had 3 or 4 albums out, but I was trying to create the impression that I had been around a long time. Those people had come to see a legendary comedian, and I didn't want them to leave thinking they had to settle for an unknown singer. About halfway through the show, a guy in the audience stood up and cupped his hands and shouted out, "I've never heard of you, but I'm going out and buy all of them." When the show was over, I got a standing ovation from the Jimmy Durante crowd. After the Detroit concert, my bookings picked up sharply. Helena did not have a major airport, and to keep my engagements, I had to drive to Great Falls, 90 miles away, and fly out of there. It was not only inconvenient, it was expensive. And money was still a big factor in our lives. Rosine was as frugal as ever. She could squeeze George Washington until he turned into Booker T. We planned ahead and saved for the smallest things, such as the movie or dinner out. My third single had reached the top 10, but the royalty checks still weren't coming from the first one. So I was running around the country playing places like the Cimarron Ballroom in Tulsa or Panther Hall in Fort Worth for $200 or $250 a pop. I badgered Jack Clement about the royalties. When am I going to start seeing something? I would say that to him. I've got a lot of expenses and not much income. It'll come, he assured me. Believe me, it'll come. The travel schedule was becoming so hectic that Rosine and I decided we would have to move to Great Falls, and we couldn't wait for the royalties. We found a 5-bedroom house there we could buy for $48,000. It was more than twice as large as our home in Helena, and gave our family a lot of growing room. But we didn't have much equity in our old house, and selling it would not give us enough money for the down payment on the new one. About that time, a guy in Hurst, Texas, wanted to put together a tour for me. He had seen how the audience reacted to me on the Willie Nelson tour and told me he could book $5,000 worth of dates in Texas alone. That was a lot of money for playing in little honky-tonks, you know. Jack Johnson was dubious, but we decided to take the chance. Any exposure I could get was important. With those bookings as our collateral, Rosine and I borrowed $5,000 from a bank in Great Falls, a very short-term loan. We were supposed to pay it back within a few weeks. We made the down payment, and I took off for Texas. "Don't you go on that stage until you get paid," my manager sternly advised me. It wasn't that easy. In Texas, I told the promoter I had to have some money up front, but he finessed around it, telling me that we would settle up later. And I was riding with him from club to club, and he kept stalling with the money. In the end, everything worked out. I got paid for the tour. We paid back the $5,000 loan and moved into the new house, but that experience made me wonder how long we would have to live on the edge. It seemed that everything I did to advance my singing career put us deeper into debt. I was turning out an album every 6 months or so, but with every recording session I sank farther into the hole with RCA. Musician, technician, and studio time cost a lot of money. And a singer doesn't get anything until all the bills are paid. Appearing on a radio or television show normally pays little or nothing, but it is something you have to do, or want to do, to sell records and build a following, and even though it means money out of your pocket, money you don't have. The first syndicated show I was invited to appear on was a program Bill Anderson hosted. It originated in Charlotte, North Carolina. To make the trip from Nashville, I had to borrow $50 from Jack Clement. As my producer, he had my future royalties as security. He got his money back out of my first check from RCA. In fact, he brought that first check to me personally. Paid to the order of Charley Pride, $138. "I want to keep that," I told him. I did, too. "I'm going to frame it." "No," he said, "you can't do that. If you don't cash it, it'll mess up their books." He chuckled. "Well, besides, you owe me $50. He went with me to cash it and got his $50 on the spot. A few months later, the next royalty payment came by mail to our house in Great Falls. Based on the size of the first one, we weren't sure what to expect. We probably would have been thrilled if it had been a few $100s. I opened the envelope and looked at the amount, $18,000. Just a couple of years earlier, my annual income had been $6,500, and now we were staring at a piece of paper worth 3 times that. As excited as we were, we realized we had to sit down and talk about this. For the first time in a long time, we were out of the red. But that much money can be a jolt. We decided we would just deposit the check and pretend we didn't have it. We would watch this singing business a while and see where it took us. My third album was released in December of 1967, and it contained several songs that had done well for other singers. Buck Owens' Act Naturally and Merle Haggard's I Threw Away the Rose were among them. It sold pretty well, but the big cut for me on that one was Does My Ring Hurt Your Finger, which followed Just Between You and Me into the top 10. I still hadn't had the monster hit, but Rosine and I learned where the singing business was taking us when the third royalty check arrived. Honey, I said, staring at it in amazement, $60,000. The German countryside flitted past the car window, but I was in no shape to enjoy it. Slouched down in my seat, exhausted from not sleeping the night before, and nursing a severe headache, I closed my eyes and tried to doze. My head hurts, I moaned to Rosine. If I could just sleep. We were driving to the show at one of the army posts with a sergeant named Pop Phillips, who was handling our bookings. Sergeant Phillip was as nice a guy as you would ever want to meet, but after a few days of playing for the GIs in Germany, I became suspicious of him. Don't trust him, I told Rosine. He's going to do something to us. She couldn't figure out what I was talking about, but it alarmed her, because it was not my nature to be suspicious and fearful of people. She began to wonder, what if he is right? Explaining to her why I feared Pop Phillips was impossible. He had done nothing, said nothing to provoke those feelings. But as the tour went on, it was as though a veil of dark gauze was drawn around me, wrapping me in paranoia and insomnia and confusion and dread. I believed someone was putting things in my drinks and trying to harm me. Under the best circumstances, it was a stressful time. We played 2 shows a day, and I was sometimes jeered by black soldiers who wanted me to sing something besides country music. Working too hard, drinking too much, and wrestling with the racial nonsense had worn me down. But that didn't account for my behavior, the strange thoughts that were bouncing around in my head. Rosine held my head all the way to the club that night. When we got there, I broke down and cried. Rosine was convinced that something was seriously out of kilter. Pride can't work, she said to Pop Phillips. There's something wrong. Within a few hours, I was in a hospital under the constant watch of a doctor or nurse or orderly. I was given tranquilizers and sedatives and still had trouble sleeping. I imagined things that weren't there. I talked nonstop, refused to take orders, and was determined to bust out of the place. At times, I had to be forcefully restrained and held in bed by nylon straps. Oddly enough, I could often control the wild moods and emotions when I tried hard enough. During Rosine's visit, I was relatively calm, almost normal. But as soon as she left, I lost control again. I was impulsive and unpredictable. Walking to the cafeteria for lunch with a group of other patients, I saw a door. And unnoticed by the orderlies, I angled toward it and walked faster, and bolted through it in a full run. The orderlies gave chase and eventually overtook me, returned me to the hospital, and strapped me to bed. After that, I was never more than arm's length away from an attendant. In a week or so, I began to get back to normal and was released from the hospital. The doctors instructed me to find a psychiatrist when I'd return home. Someone could provide the treatment I needed. Their diagnosis, manic depression. That was in 1968, and we still lived in Great Falls, Montana. As ordered, I visited a psychiatrist who tried to explain manic depression to me. My assumptions that the problems in Germany had been brought on by stress, fatigue, and alcohol, he assured me, were false. It is a chemical imbalance, he explained, and can be completely controlled by medication, without which the problem will reoccur. The imbalance has something to do with the amount of salt and liquids in and around cells, but not a lot is known about what causes the imbalance. Drinking and exhaustion would aggravate it, the doctor said, but would not cause it. You will have to take medication for the rest of your life, he said. I've never liked taking drugs of any kind, not even aspirin. I just didn't like the feeling of being medicated, of being controlled by chemicals. He gave me a prescription for tranquilizers and lithium, the most common treatment today. Was still experimental back then. I took the pills for a while, and then threw them away. I refused to believe there was anything wrong with me. Manic depression takes several different forms. I learned over the years, and it's much more common than I realized. In most people, the moods swing from extreme highs to extreme lows. For me, the highs were more extreme than the lows. My highs appeared to be typical: sleeplessness, mind speeding like a cruise missile, talkativeness, restlessness, grand schemes and plans. I've been told that during those times, when the energy level is high and little sleep is required, many people become extremely creative and productive. In a lot of cases, the lows are debilitating and paralyzing. People are unable to work or even get out of bed. I was lucky. The dips took the milder form of headaches and weariness. For several years after the episode in Germany, there were no serious problems. My second major bout occurred in 1982. I began sleeping less and made it difficult for Rosine to sleep too. I would lie in bed and talk incessantly. I became distrustful of everyone around me except Rosine. One common symptom of a manic high is lavish spending. I bought a limited edition studs for myself and an expensive ring for Rosine and myself. I was making a lot of money at the time, so that wasn't excessive. It was just out of character. Another clue to Rosine that my body's chemistry was tilting again. Slowly, it got worse. Small noises bothered me so that I threw televisions and VCRs out the door. She hired orderlies and nurse's aide to come to the house. I was obsessed with getting out of the house, getting in the car, and driving off. I tried to bolt through every door I passed. At night, Rosine put a belt around my waist and hooked her hand through it to keep me from slipping out of bed while she slept. She was exhausted most of the time. Her mother came to stay with us, and my brother Harmon, who lived in Dallas then, came by now and then to help out. While they were there, they later told me I became convinced that I was a preacher. Not just any preacher, but Moses himself, with a staff in my hand, and I walked through the house preaching sermons. Rosine had contacted a psychiatrist, Dr. William Waltrip, about my condition. He prescribed lithium, but I refused to take it. Most of the time I flushed him down the toilet. She was told she couldn't admit me without my consent. Fortunately for me, she can be very persuasive. And in those periods of confusion and paranoia, she was the only person on earth I trusted or would listen to. I checked myself in the hospital. With the aid of lithium, my chemical balance was restored in a few days, in time to keep an engagement at Billy Bob, Texas in Fort Worth. Except for that one occasion in Germany, I never had to cancel a show because of manic depression. I've gone on stage halfway there, fighting to control it with willpower, and the audience never suspected a thing. The show at Billy Bob's went off without a hitch, and not long after that I stopped taking the lithium. I developed a skin rash serious enough to send me to a dermatologist. He couldn't diagnose precisely what caused it, but I blamed the lithium and refused to take it anymore. Lithium was not responsible, the doctor told me, but I was still convinced that I could whip the manic depression without pharmaceutical assistance. We were in Albuquerque for a charity golf tournament, and I went into one of my talkative spells and couldn't sleep. This time, Rosine wasted no time. One of the charities the tournament benefited was a Catholic hospital. Rosine went to one of the nuns and said, "I need the name of a doctor who can talk to Charley's doctor. Give him some medication." After speaking to Dr. Walter, the Albuquerque physician prescribed Thorazine and sleeping pills. Rosine went to the tournament chairman. "Pride is manic, and he's having a mini episode," she said. "I'm taking him home." Those mini episodes were likely to happen at any time, but the severe bout with manic depression occurred in the wintertime. There's a form of depression, seasonal affective disorder, called SAD. That occurs mostly in the winter and is triggered by a lack of sunlight. That may or may not have been a factor in my case, but the fact that my worst episode were seasonal, popping up in the winter breaks from my concert tours, prevented them from interfering in my career, and therefore kept me from grasping the seriousness of the problem. I finally came to terms with manic depression and lithium in 1989. That episode began like others, talking at a rapid pace, insomnia, but grew much worse. I had attacks of panic, anxiety, and delusion. Dr. Walter prescribed lithium again, but I wouldn't take it. Craig and his wife stayed at our house to help Rosine, mostly to keep me from doing something harmful to myself. When I walked around the house, someone was always with me, usually positioning themselves between me and the door. Rosine called Dr. Walter. "I won't go through what I went through in 1982, she told him. "I want something done." Dr. Walter arranged for me to be placed in one of the suites at Baylor Hospital, but we had to hire someone to keep me from leaving. That lasted one day before I was moved, strapped to a gurney, to the psychiatric ward where I could be restrained to the bed. I wasn't aware of what town I was in or what planet I was on. One of the downsides to celebrities is that people sometimes treat you differently than they do others when they shouldn't, deferring to you rather than demanding of you. Rosine felt that was the case with William Walter. He was my friend as well as my doctor, and she believed he was being too gentle with me. If I refused to take the medication, he would coax rather than command. As often as not, I didn't respond to the coaxing. Rosine waited while I was checked into the psychiatric ward, and then confronted Dr. Walter. She was strained to the limit and broke into tears. "I want the name of the best doctor in Dallas to treat a manic," she said. "Pride doesn't need a friend. He needs a doctor. You're going to let him out-talk you. He doesn't need that. Why are you treating him when he's telling you what he's going to do and what he's not?" From that point on, my relationship with Bill Walter changed. He was far less accommodating to me than he had been before. He administered medication whether or not I approved, and he gave instruction for the nurses to follow, whether I protested or not. A few weeks after I was released, Rosine and I went to his office for a checkup, and he insisted that I stay on the lithium and maintain certain other routines that I found disagreeable. I argued with him, but he wouldn't budge. "But doctor," I said, "you're my friend." He looked at Rosine and back at me and said, "I'm not your friend, I'm your doctor." In truth, he is both. I've only seen him professionally a few times since then, and it's just talk. I'm thankful for that. Manic depression can be a nightmare for the sufferers and for everyone around them. I was probably hesitant to accept the fact that I was afflicted by it because it smacked a mental disease or emotional disorder or something just as horrible. It is neither of those. It is a medical condition like diabetes or any other malady over which the mind has no control. My suggestion to anyone who suffers from it or even suspect they do is to just get help. It is treatable and controllable. I've taken lithium regularly for the past few years and have had no further bouts with manic depression. No wild highs, no migraines, and no imagining things that aren't there. And I sleep very well. By 1969, it was obvious that we would have to leave Montana. Travel connections from there were simply too difficult and too time-consuming. Rosine and I discussed several cities where we might want to live. Nashville would have been an obvious choice, but memories of segregation still weighed on both of our minds. Our children were young, and we wanted a different environment for them. It was 1969 after all, and only a year after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in Memphis. Denver was high on our list. We loved the mountains, and the city was centrally located. Of course, we had lived there in the past, too. Had a good airport and was a good place for kids. But Denver still lacked certain amenities. There were no Denver Broncos or Denver Nuggets back then, and we both wanted access to professional sports. On my way back to Montana from Atlanta, Georgia, I made a connection through Dallas. I spent most of the layover hanging around the departure lounge, sizing up the passengers. Along came a guy in his 30s with a certain air about him. He's flying first class, I bet. Sure enough, we got on the plane and he had the seat right behind me. "Is that a putter?" he asked. I was just getting into golf, and a fan had given me a gold-plated putter with a few unusual attachments to help me out. It had a horn, a light, and a device for measuring the distance to the cup. "Sort of," I said. I was sitting by the window and the aisle seat was vacant. "Do you mind if I move up there?" he asked. I said, "No, I don't." He introduced himself as Jerry Lastelick, attorney at law, and told me he was on his way to do some legal work for either Lee Elder, a black golfer, or Lee Elder's first wife. I suppose he thought I was another black golfer, and there weren't many of them around. Are you a golfer, he asked. Oh, no, I'm just trying to be. I'm a country music singer. As we talked, I told him about our plans to move from Great Falls and the cities we had considered. Have you ever thought about Dallas, he said. We hadn't. Tell me about it, I said. He did, and before we landed, Jerry gave me his card. Call me if you want to come to Dallas and look around, he said. The next week I was scheduled to do a show in Atlanta, and Rosie and I decided she would go to Dallas to look around, and I would join her there after my Atlanta engagement. Jerry set us up with a realtor. We saw a house that was just being finished by the builders. This is what I want, Rosine said. We moved in that summer. Before we arrived, word got around. There's one moving in. But the neighbors were gracious and welcomed us to the street. Some brought champagne over to christen the new house. If there was any concern about integrating the neighborhood, it may have had less to do with our race than with the fact that I was a country music singer. It got back to us later that there had been some fretting over the lifestyle we might bring to the street. Those show business people have rowdy ways, wild parties. Rosine and I were not given to boisterous revelry. And to the relief of the neighbors, maybe the disappointment of a few, ours was one of the quietest houses in the neighborhood. Beside good schools, a good airport, and cowboys, Dallas had golf courses, and golf was fast becoming a preoccupation. Some might say an obsession with me. I'm still not as good as I would like to be. I took lessons to learn how to do things the right way, and can hold my own on most courses. As we settled into Dallas, the Great Southwest Golf Club gave me honorary membership, and later I joined Brookhaven Country Club. Because of those two memberships, I wasn't really looking for another place to play, but in 1979, James Harrison, a business associate of mine, suggested I join Royal Oaks Country Club, where he was a member. We only have about 600 members, he said. I said, well, I already belong to two. Why don't you fill out an application anyway, he said. We have 30 on the waiting list, so it'll take a while to get down to you. I sent in the application and waited. It took some time before my name to move up the list. After a while, I received a letter from Royal Oaks which said, Article 12, Section 3 states that if 5 or more members object to an applicant, 5 or more had objected. Word got out, and right away camera crews and reporters from the 3 major Dallas network affiliate stations descended on my office. We checked and found out there are no Jews or blacks in that club, a reporter said. Look, I said, there's a possibility that is it. And in any case, let me say this, that club has 595 other members who let that rule exist. I don't want to be around them either, not just the 5 who objected, but the whole 600. If anyone really doubted that I was rejected because of my skin pigmentation, the proof wasn't long in coming. Another black guy went out there as a member's guest, and somebody put a dead rat in his bag. Mostly what I feel for those kind of people is pity. If that's the way they believe, so be it. But I wasn't going to let them draw me into their moral swamp. If you're not careful, you can wake up some mornings and realize you missed a lot of enjoyment because you spent too much time worrying about those people and what they think. There's little to be gained by letting yourself be saddled with that kind of demented mentality. Sometime around 2 in the morning, the telephone rang at my hotel on Prince Edward Island, and I answered in a half-stupor induced by fatigue and whiskey. We had had a good show that night, and afterwards, feeling good, I went to my room to unwind with a bottle of V.O. The ringing woke me up from the first stages of sleep. Yeah? Pride, this is Rosine. Another voice broke in. This is George Jones, not that George Jones. This one was an executive with Mercantile Bank, the correspondent bank of the First Texas Bank in Dallas, of which I was majority stockholder. I tried to clear my head, and I'm on the line too, Charley. It was Jerry Lastlick, my attorney, and the guy who had introduced me to the banking business. What's going on, I asked. They proceeded to give me a rundown, which sobered me up and woke me up pretty quick. A kite had been run on the bank, major losses, federal examiners may shut the doors, president tossed out and locked out, immediate cash required. A lot of what they were telling me got lost in the fog. But I understood one thing. The bank had to have a $1.2 million cash infusion, or the regulators would close it and I would lose everything. Not just my investment in stock, but most of the $500,000 I had on deposit. If I could come up with $800,000, another investor would chip in $400,000, and Mercantile Bank would lend us the rest. Jerry and George explained that to me. What you're telling me is that I have no choice, I said. Something like that, Jerry said. There I was at 2 a.m, half asleep, half a continent away, trying to deal with a multi-million-dollar banking problem. It was a big leap from picking cotton for $3 a hundred, I'll tell you that. Well, Pride, you wanted to be a businessman, I thought, and at the moment it was hard to remember why. Early in my singing career, I began to pay attention to those entertainers who seemed to have a talent for putting their earnings to work for them. Bob Hope was probably the ultimate one that I watched. Eddie Arnold, Roy Acuff, and of course Gene Autry were others who had done well in business. I didn't talk to any of them at length about their activities, but I tried to pick up on what they were doing and file it away for the future. Buck Owens also made some very shrewd investments too, particularly in the real estate around his adopted hometown of Bakersfield, California. While I was touring with him, he talked to me a lot about what he was doing and what was good for him. I wish there had been time for me to learn more from him. I might have avoided a few of the potholes I stepped into along the way. I've had winners and losers, but probably more of the latter. I'm not complaining. There's a learning process you have to go through, and you have to pay for your education. You pay through the nose a lot of times before you learn. When your career is hot and the hits keeps coming fast, you make a lot of money in a short period of time. There are only two things you can do with the money: spend it or invest it. If you do either the wrong way, you're in trouble. There's never a shortage of advice, a lot of it well-meaning but misguided. Swindlers and con artists are also circling around you. Because you're performing all the time, you have to trust someone to help you with your financial affairs, and that leaves you vulnerable. The more you expand yourself, widen your affairs, increase your holdings, the more dependent you become on others to manage things for you. You're not able to watch every angle and see every way you can be had. Willie Nelson got $16 million or $18 million in debt to the Internal Revenue Service that way. You know, the people who were managing his money did a lousy job of it. Some of his money was put into tax shelters that turned out to be illegal, but there were times when I was urged to do the same thing. People with money use tax shelters, I was told. I never bit on that one. My attitude was, I'll pay my taxes and keep what's left over and sleep well at night, and I mean that's what I did. Consequently, I've never had trouble with the IRS. They audited us 5 times in a row and couldn't believe we were paying that honestly. They kept coming back, costing me a lot of money by tying up really my attorneys and my accountants, but the only big error they ever found was in our favor. We had overpaid one year and got a big chunk back. Looking back at what happened to the banking business in the 1980s, I can say now that First Texas Bank might easily have become my worst investment. Actually, it's been my best. Jerry Laslick and some other lawyers formed the bank in 1975, 6 years after I moved to Dallas. They solicited friends and clients to invest in it and put in $25,000, a modest sum, considering what I had been wagering on other investments. In 1977, some of the bank's founders wanted to sell their interest and start another bank. They held about 50% of the stock. Would you be interested in buying any of their shares? Jerry asked me. I'll just buy it all, I told him. The bank had good growth in those 2 years, and because Jerry was involved and his law offices were in the bank building, I felt more than comfortable with the investment. Banks were safe, well-regulated, and hardly ever failed. I bought out the lawyers who wanted to sell and found myself with 52% of the stock. It was only a $10 million bank, but it had a lot of potential. It was just a few weeks after becoming the majority stockholder that I went on a tour of Canada, and I was in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, when the federal bank examiners notified Jerry of the check-kiting scheme. Some friends of the bank president were involved, and the initial losses were $1.2 million. We had just gone through our annual audit by an outside accounting firm and state banking examiners, and they hadn't detected it. The feds did, however, and because I owned controlling interest, I was the guy holding the bag. After recovering most of the money, our losses amounted to at least $200,000 or $300,000. First Texas, under sound management, prospered. It has grown to a $100 million bank, one of the largest minority-owned financial institutions in the country. At one time, there were 9 or 10 banks within a 3-mile radius of us. Now there are only 3. The others have fallen victim to the economic disaster that hit Texas in the 1980s. Rosine serves on the board of directors, and my participation is mostly limited to attending annual stockholders' meetings. To be sure, I haven't batted 1,000 in business, but that bank is as good as a home run with the bases loaded. Besides the bank, I have an office building in Dallas, one in Nashville, and a 247-acre ranch in North Texas. I believe you can't go wrong investing in the right real estate. Several years ago, I went back to Mississippi and bought the first land my father ever rented. Sometimes people have tried to suggest that I bought that farm to flaunt my success, to redeem my impoverished sharecropping childhood or something. The truth is less glamorous. It is good land, first of all. Daddy keeps a small garden out there, and he oversees the property for me. But I didn't buy it to make some kind of statement. It was a good, safe investment, and that's the only kind I'm interested in these days. If someone comes to me now with a proposal, I'm willing to talk about it, but I'll tell them up front, all I'm going to be out of is my time. I'll invest my likeness, my marketability, but nothing out of my pocket. The first time I realized that there were aspects to being an entertainer that I had not anticipated was when a woman came up to me after a show and asked where was I from. "You're not from this planet," she insisted. At first I couldn't tell if she was joking or if one of her tires was out around. "You've been sent here from somewhere," she wasn't joking. My best efforts to convince her didn't seem very successful, and she eventually walked away. Fans are what makes a performer, and I've always taken them seriously and treated them with courtesy and respect. A few have become friends to me and my family. Often, I've looked out across the audience and see faces I've been seeing at my shows for 20-some years. There was a woman from Hershey, Pennsylvania, who used to come to 20 or 30 of my shows a year. She had lost her legs and got around in a wheelchair. She died several years ago, and I received a letter from her daughter thanking me for years of enjoyment I had given her mother. In truth, whatever I gave to her was returned in full. The pleasure of seeing her at show after show was immeasurable. Doris McNeil of Nashville is another of those familiar faces. Just about every time I'm in that city for a recording session or television show or concert, she shows up with homemade cookies for me and my band. Among my crew and around Nashville, she was affectionately called the Cookie Lady. From time to time, I've received letters from fans with strange but heartwarming stories to tell. One was from a woman who had been hospitalized and suffered from amnesia. She played 8-track tapes of my songs, and her memory began to return. Another was from a family with a sick child who could not eat or keep medication down except when listening to my song. It's a little scary to think you might have that kind of effect on people's lives, but it is also gratifying to think that the good you do goes beyond the stage and the recording studio. But there's another side of the artist-fan relationship that is sometimes troubling. Early in my career, I began receiving letters from a woman in the Midwest who claimed to be my mother. "I'm your white mother you don't know about," her first letter said. She explained that I was conceived in a haystack and that her family, unhappy about her union with a black man, insisted that she give me away. She wrote several letters, and after a while I stopped hearing from her. I've kept most of the fan letters I've received, and I never tire of hearing from the people who buy my records and come to my shows. Fans are quick to tell you what they like and are about as quick to tell you what they don't like. To me, they are a good barometer of audience taste and attitudes towards music. In my motel room, I watched the news reports and tried to decide what I would do, if I should go ahead and perform or cancel the show. My manager was not with me on that trip to Big Springs, Texas, and so I had to make the decision myself. The television networks had preempted their regular programming to cover the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr., and the ugly mood that had quickly settled on cities across the country. I sat glued to my television set in my room, heartsick by what had happened in Memphis that day. In Memphis, where I had spent some of my best years playing baseball. courting the woman I would marry, learning about people and life. Dr. King had gone there to lead peaceful demonstration by striking sanitation workers. On the night of April 3rd, 1968, he made a speech that was later called prophetic, because it seemed to foretell violence. In less than 24 hours, he was killed by a sniper as he stood on the walkway outside his motel room. We each react to public tragedies in our own way, and that afternoon, I had to come to terms with my own limitation. You're a singer, I told myself. You were hired to sing. The show has been booked. You're just one man in a small town a long way from anywhere. What do you gain by not doing what you agreed to do? I got dressed, walked through the motel lobby, and found a cab to take me to the show. I tried to sing my best that night, but it wasn't my finest hour. But what I gained from that experience was a determination not to allow my work to become mingled with the political and social backdrop of the moment. In 1984, Dan Hexter, my agent, told me I had been invited to sing the national anthem at the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco. I told him to turn down the offer. I don't want anyone to think I'm favoring one party, I said. Dan then arranged for me to also sing at the Republican convention. It would be good exposure because millions of people watched those conventions on television. I couldn't be accused of trying to help one party or another. After singing the Star-Spangled Banner for the Democrats, I learned it had not been broadcast. What was preempted by a commercial or banter by the news anchors or something. Instead of singing for the millions watching television, I sang only for the few thousand who were in the convention hall. When they learned I had appeared at the Democratic convention, the Republicans withdrew their invitation for me to be an official part of their program. A friend who came to town as a delegate by the name of Cy Arthur, who ran a tool and die company that made a lot of its money from defense contracting. Cy was well connected. I had met him through a charity golf tournament he ran up in Ohio called Bogey Busters. Cy called when he got to Dallas and invited Rosine and me to dinner. Afterwards, we went down to the convention center, and he took me up to his box overlooking the activities. "Come on," he said, "let's go down on the floor." Well, all that year I had had a sciatic nerve that I couldn't hardly go on stage, so I didn't want to go because I was hurting. But lo and behold, in all that mob, there were 2 empty seats conveniently located right on the front row, right next to Jerry Falwell, and all the seats held by George Bush and his family. As packed as the place was, how could 2 seats just happen to be available? As soon as Rosine and I sat down, 3 or 4 cameras turned on us. Charley and Rosine Pride in the front row, looking for all the world like 2 delegates to the Republican National Convention. I looked up at Cy and said, "Well, you got me." He grinned and tried to feign innocence, but for weeks after that, when I was on tour, people came up to me and said, "I saw you at the Republican convention. I didn't know you were a Republican." Well, what do you know? I guess no harm was done. There are worse things than being a Democrat or a Republican. I've always approached religion the same as politics. I'm cautious and conservative about joining organizations, and that includes churches. I grew up in the Baptist home and was a member of a Baptist church for a while in Montana, so I'm a Baptist, but I don't belong to any church now. All my brothers and sisters all grew up as Baptists, but now 3 of them are Seventh-day Adventists, and Rosine was a Baptist until we moved to Dallas. Now she is a Catholic. That doesn't bother me too much. My son Craig participates in the Institute of Divine Metaphysics or something like that. That's his preference. A person's beliefs are a private matter between him and God. I believe in God too, but I never wanted to get caught up in organized religion, and I wouldn't try to influence someone else's belief. I've been in just about every sort of worshiping place except Muslim, Buddhist, and Jewish temples, and I hope to visit those someday. Everyone should believe in something, but they shouldn't be forced. Too many religious organizations are in the business of enforcing beliefs. What happened in Waco, Texas in the spring of 1993, after all, happened under the guise of organized religion. My faith is simple, to believe and not to pretend to know. The twin-engine Fairchild turboprop began a gradual descent on the flight path into Dallas. At 6,800 feet, we crossed over Bridgeport, Texas, and something hit us so hard that it knocked the plane sideways. I looked out the window and saw nothing. The plane shuddered and swayed for a second and then more or less stabilized. We were about to resume the card game that had been in progress since leaving Rapid City, South Dakota, when the pilot's voice came on the intercom. "Buckle up, we have a problem," he said. In the cockpit, Freddie Chardo, the co-pilot, was riding the rudder like a bronc buster, and Bob Sowers was talking to the control tower in Dallas. Sowers wrestled the crippled plane to Meacham Field, brought it down to a few feet over the runway, and cut the engine, letting it drop with a thud into the paved surface. The tires squealed, and the plane rocked back and forth and coasted to a stop a few feet from the end of the runway. When we got out, I looked up at the tail section. The stabilizer looked as though it had been chewed off. 3 television camera crews and a gang of reporters ran toward us. "What happened?" they asked. "Beats me," I said. "We were playing poker and the pilot just told us we had a slight problem." A newspaper headline the next day said, "Entertainer almost deals his last hand." We later were told that we had been hit by a Cessna 172 that had taken off from Love Field carrying a student pilot and flight instructor. They were flying instrument hooded, not in touch with the control tower. Their plane crashed and both were killed. The only casualty to my crew from that mid-air collision was Ron Baker, the lead guitarist for us, and it was temporary. "I'm through," he said. Shaken by the experience, I quit. He later came back. On flight to Los Angeles, I was seated next to an elderly woman. After talking for a while, I said, "You're a Leo, aren't you?" "Why, yes." "You were born in August?" "Yes." "Like August the 4th? She drew away from me. She looked between us as though she suspected something had been dropped, like a driver's license or something, for identification. "How do you do that?" she said. I laughed and said, "I'm an amateur. Some astrologers who really study people can tell you what kind of food you like, or what you did to your sister when you were 16 years old, etc." She was dubious, I suppose, as a lot of people are, but I believe it is possible to tell what sign some people were born under by watching their eyes, watching how they walk or how they talk. Johnny Duncan was one of the first opening acts I hired for my show, and he is the one who really initiated me into astrology. He had a fascination with the subject, and one day he gave me a book entitled Sun Signs by Linda Goodman. I got hooked, too. The theory that people are somehow marked by the planetary alignments at the instance of their birth was intriguing, and there was a certain logic to it. 12 signs, 3 of fire, 3 of air, 3 of water, and 3 of earth. Each one is essential to life. Each has an opposite, and opposite attracts. Astrology isn't like religion or some belief that controls my life, but I think it has practical applications. If nothing else, it hones my ability to remember people's birthday and other dates, but mostly it helps me understand people and myself a little better. To me, it's just another clue to human nature. Generally, there's a fair amount of turnover among band members. It is not uncommon for musicians to go on to individual careers as singers after they've been around for a while, or they just want a change of scenery. So you have to keep finding new talent. I was lucky because so many of my musicians stayed with me a long time. The longevity record belongs to Preston Buchanan, who has been my bass player since 1969. I've always felt loyalty to people who were loyal to me. And early in my career, we organized our operation like any other business with a regular payroll, pension plans, and insurance benefits for the band, as well as for everyone else. I think I have a reputation for being pretty easy to work for. If I weren't, Preston probably would have been gone a long time ago. He used to drink his share, as most of us did in our younger days, and his feelings lubricated with whiskey always spilled out of him easily. We were in a bar in St. Louis one night, and after a show, and none of us was feeling any pain. I have no idea what triggered it, but all of a sudden Preston was telling me exactly what he thought of my picking and singing. To put it nicely, he thought I still had some things to learn. Naturally, I didn't agree with him, but I wasn't going to fire a damn good musician for speaking his mind. There's a risk in surrounding yourself only with people who stroke your ego. You lose the benefit of their honest opinion. When I was starting out, I had a lot of help from established singers who took a chance by taking me on stage with them and nudging me along when they thought I needed nudging. After I became established and had the Charley Pride show, I wanted to develop new talent whenever I could by taking them on tour with me and helping them get recording contracts. Many times I sat in clubs in Nashville listening to aspiring artists and recognized someone who deserved a break. Gary Stewart, Earl Thomas Conley, Johnny Russell, Johnny Duncan, and Janie Fricke each opened for me early in their careers. Stewart, Conley, and Fricke were at one time clients of Chardon booking agents, which I own. For one of my early tours of Australia, I hired 3 backup singers named Dave Rowland, Vicky Baker, and Jackie Franz. They had people jumping out of their seats down there. When we got back to the States, I called Jerry Bradley at RCA, and I said, "We haven't put together a backup." I said, "We've got an act here, man. I'd like you to come and take a look at him." We had a gig in Belle Vernon, Pennsylvania, not long after that, and Jerry showed up. At my insistence, he did not tell the backup singers he was coming. I didn't want them to be nervous because the president of RCA was in the audience. They put on one of the finest shows you've ever seen. They knocked people's hat in the creek. Jerry watched the show and afterwards came backstage. "Hello," he said to the trio. "I'm Jerry Bradley from RCA. I'm going to sign you to a record contract." They all stared at him and not sure that they heard him right. It wasn't long before Queen of the Silver Dollar was a major hit, and my backup singers, Dave and Sugar, had their own show. Jack Johnson and I had gone to hear a singer named Ronnie Milsap, who did mostly rock and roll on a small label called Chips Records. That night he did a little bit of everything, rock, pop, country, R&B, and played the piano. It was hard to believe he was blind. "That's our man right there," I told Jack. We talked to him about signing with us to manage him. I told him I would talk to the people at RCA about giving him a record deal and would hire him to open my show. Ronnie slid into country as easily and as successfully as any rock singer I had ever seen, and I like to think I was of some help to him. Not long after we recruited him, someone brought me a song called Pure Love. I like it, but I had one hit out at the time and several songs in the works, so I told him give it to Ronnie. He did so well that he didn't stay with me opening my show for very long. Within 14 months, he was on his own and well on his way to becoming a star. In time, he would win 6 Grammy Awards and become a permanent fixture on the country chart. It is a good feeling to find someone talented and help them get on their way, but a couple of bad experiences discouraged me from getting too involved with someone else's career. Dave and Sugar got into a squabble over who was going to get how much. When they started out, Dave Rowland was going to own 50% of the act, and Vicky and Jackie Franz would have 25% each. Then Dave wanted 100% of everything. You can't have a successful act with that kind of fighting going on. And because my company was booking them, I was frequently drawn into their spats. It wasn't something I enjoyed dealing with. Splitting up with Jack Johnson was one of the most agonizing ordeals of my life. For a time, we were one of the best teams I'd ever seen. But what started out as an exciting adventure ended up in a heap of acrimony and ugliness. We spent a lot of time on the road together, and that gave us plenty of time to plan and analyze and generate ideas. Career moves have to be plotted carefully. If too much is left to chance, you'll find yourself skidding backwards. Jack's instincts were excellent. He helped me pick out the right clothes to project the image we wanted. Together we worked out the permanent tan, the line we used a lot of times that broke a lot of ice in the early concerts we did. He had a good sense of which levers to pull and which doors to knock on next. My first contract with Jack was for 5 years with a 1-year option. And when the time came to renew it, I still had reservation about the split. My records and public appearances were starting to generate generous revenue, but expenses were pretty extravagant, too. I wanted to think about it a while and talk it over with Rosine. Jack and I were driving to Atlanta, and he handed me the new contract. Before I sign again, I want to take it back and let Rosine and I talk about it. That angered him. "I don't manage Rosine," he screamed. "Look, man, you've been to college," I said. "I've got an 11th grade education. Don't I get a chance to talk to someone?" He said, "You got to sign it now." Before we got to Atlanta, I had signed the contract, but was unhappy with myself for doing it. We were friends, partners, and a team, and I felt he should not have pressured me. But at the same time, he hadn't held a gun to my head either. I was an adult, and could have drawn the line wherever I wanted. But whatever resentment I felt past, I still had faith in Jack, still believed in what the two of us had accomplished. We started a publishing company called Pi Gem, a combination of my astrological sign Pisces and his Gemini. We bought some office buildings in Nashville, and we were going to develop a stable of talent to manage under the umbrella of Pi Gem. All of our activities would be tied to the publishing company, and we would split 50-50 on those. If I balked at one of his ideas, Jack would try to bring me around by going to Rosine. He felt that I trusted her judgment, and he figured if he could recruit her as an ally, he could get me to go along. She saw through that fairly quickly and began to question the ways that our money was being spent. At first, it irritated me when she questioned the way our money was being spent. My loyalty to him, my dependence on him, made me defensive, but my doubts about some of the things that were happening grew as our activities broadened. For every joint venture we entered, Jack borrowed his half from me, so I was putting up 100% of the money. He paid it back, but without interest. It slowly occurred to me that there was something inequitable about that arrangement. When we formed Pi Gem, Jack and I agreed that 50% of the profits would go into finding and developing new talent. If we found someone promising, we would manage them through Pi Gem and therefore share equally from handling their careers. Jack had found a few people he liked and wanted to invest in them. I didn't share his opinion and their potential and declined to go along. "Is it all right for you if I do it on my own?" he said. I said, "Yeah. Put your own money behind them." He did, and they flopped. Millsap was a winner. However, certainly the best talent I had ever happened across. The money for managing Ronnie was supposed to go into Pi Gem, and Jack Johnson and I would share equally in the profits. The money was coming in all right, but Jack had decided to manage Ronnie on his own. "Well, look, two people can't manage somebody," he told me. "I'm going to manage him just as the way I manage you." "Wait a minute, that wasn't the agreement," I said. "That's the way we're going to do it," he said. Rosie's sister Hortense and her husband came to visit us in the summer of 1969, just a couple of months after we moved to Texas. They were both teachers, and they liked Dallas so much that before leaving they picked up a job application form from the Dallas School District. While Jack Johnson was managing my career and investments from Nashville, Rosine was handling a lot of the business in Dallas. We had set up a small office in Dallas to handle such things as the band payroll and the expenses and the like. Somebody had to answer the phone and handle correspondence and keep the books, and as the job became more demanding, Rosine wanted to hire Hortense. Hortense, like Rosine, had a thorough understanding of my business and had become an excellent administrator. I had an attorney, accountants, a booking agent, a road manager, and an office building in Dallas to house everything I was involved in. Why did I need offices in Nashville? On the way to Mississippi to visit my father, I made a side trip to Nashville to talk to Jack about our situation. It seemed that he had not considered the possibility that I might dissolve our partnership. We had a long, serious talk, and I expressed my feelings about a lot of things, and Jack tried to convince me that I couldn't make it without him. He went into his secretary and had her type up a short statement. He handed it to me. It wasn't a contract, and I was uncertain what to make of it. I went into another room and called Rosine. "Jack wants me to sign this piece of paper," I said. "It isn't a contract." I don't recall the language now, but I read it to her, and she and I agreed that it would probably have the effect of keeping me tied to him at least for a while. "Don't you sign anything without letting Jerry see it first," she said. By the time I got back to Dallas, I felt as though a big burden had been lifted from me. Jerry Lastelick looked at the paper Jack had given me to sign and confirm what Rosine and I had concluded. It would have tied me to Jack for a while long, and I had already decided that he and I were not going to make it together. As far as I was concerned, the split could be amicable. But after Jack realized that my decision was firm, he became very hostile. My younger brother Ed was singing professionally at the time, and Jack tried to play us against each other. "I'm going to manage him, and we're going to bury you," he said. Amid all that bitterness, we still had to dissolve our joint business. He took one of the Nashville office buildings, and I took the commercial building. My main concern was not letting go of the publishing company, and Jack agreed to let me buy out his interest in that. He charged me every penny it was worth. I had to borrow about $300,000, but I managed to keep Pi Gem. I didn't have the time to run the company personally, so I turned the management over to Tom Collins, who had been working for us quite a while. He ran it very well, and it was one of the most active publishing companies in Nashville until we sold it a few years ago to Lawrence Welk for about $4.8 million. Financially, the split with Jack was fair to us both, and I saw no reason for us to be enemies. But not long afterward, I was back in Nashville and went to a club with Glenn Keener, who had been my lead guitar player for a while, and Elroy Kahunny, who was with RCA. Jack was there with a group of people, and apparently he had been drinking a little too much, and I had had a few myself. Jack asked us over to his table. He was upset and unusually hostile. I don't remember what triggered it, but we had been there just a short time, and Jack was letting his dissatisfaction spill out. "You ignorant nigger son of a bitch," he said, glaring at me. His voice ricocheted around in my head, which was not at its clearest. Glenn, Elroy, and I looked at each other, got up, and walked out. The words hurt, but I felt sorry for him more than anything else. Jack later tried to blame the outburst on liquor. No, I told him, it was there all the time. The liquor just helped you say it right out. Over the years, Jack called many times to try to make amends. I've accepted his apology because I believe he offered it in sincerity. On a show that was televised nationally in the spring of 1993, George Jones received the Pioneer Award from the Academy of Country Music, that organization's version of a Hall of Fame. A year earlier, he had received a similar award from the Country Music Association. No one was more deserving of the recognition. In one way or another, George has probably influenced just about every country singer who has come along in the last 15 or 20 years. But in accepting the Pioneer Award, George felt the need to tack on to his thank yous a message to the radio moguls. "Don't write us old-timers off," he said. "We ain't dead yet." Not dead, just silent. If you listen to radio in major markets across the country, you'll rarely hear the likes of George Jones, Merle Haggard, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, Willie Nelson, Tammy Wynette, Ronnie Millsap, Mel Tillis, or Charley Pride, or anybody else in the business over the age of 45. I can tell you what Billy Parker, a DJ at KVOO in Tulsa, told me. It's the consultant syndrome. Some marketing or programming company in New York or someplace comes up with a format, and everybody in Podunk, USA buys into it. It's a short playlist. They repeat the same old thing over and over. They bring in DJs from rock stations, and they don't know what real country music is. I believe what happened to the country music industry was this. The urban cowboy craze of the 1970s brought a lot of young fans over from other forms. But when that fad died down, country music swung back to the more traditional sound, to people such as Reba McEntire and George Strait and Randy Travis. Having seen what the urban cowboy mania did for the industry, the moguls were looking for that kind of surge again. They wanted to appeal to the folks who were tired of rap and heavy metal and the lyrics of violence, sex, drugs, and politics. Along came some good young artists, Garth Brooks, and Alan Jackson, and Clint Black, and Vince Gill, to name a few, who helped broaden the appeal of country music and created an even bigger audience, which could only be good for the industry. But now, look here, the situation, at least for the George Joneses and the Charley Prides, was that the people who produced the records gained too much control over what's being played on the air. They were putting their money behind a small group of singers and influencing the DJs to play nobody else. Jerry Bradley left RCA in 1983 and was replaced by Joe Galante, a man with a plan that did not include Charley Pride and a lot of other established singers who had done pretty well by that label. Galante was one of the major forces behind the so-called youth movement in Nashville. The signals I received were loud and clear. The label quickly lost interest in me, and the snubs came in a lot of forms. I had trouble getting RCA interested in recording my songs or in promoting the records it did cut. At an award show in Los Angeles, RCA provided limos for most of its artists, including some who were new and relatively unknown, but not for good old Charley Pride. Both Rosine and my attorney urged me to consider changing labels. I guess I was a little slow to recognize that was what I needed or what RCA wanted. Why should I suspect anything like that? In 20 years, I had sold more records for RCA than any artist except Elvis Presley. For RCA, I had 35 number one singles, 12 gold albums in the United States, and 31 gold and 4 platinum albums worldwide. In all, I think I had sold about 25 million records for that company. All of a sudden, I was a non-entity there. Go ahead and draft a letter requesting my release, I told Jerry. If nothing else, maybe it will jolt RCA into paying more attention to its established artists. Joe Galante paid attention all right, long enough to release me from a contract. It was a shock, and it made me realize that something more radical than I had imagined was going on in the industry. It had to do with new marketing areas, mainly television. Videos were fast becoming a major sales tool, a quick way to promote fresh talent. Until the success of MTV, television had not been a huge influence on music because, except for a few variety shows and occasional specials, there were few showcases even for established performers. But cable television had a lot of time to fill up, and music videos were not just inexpensive programming. They were popular, with a huge audience of young viewers. To compete with MTV, the country music moguls felt they had to appeal to the same young audience and do it the way MTV did. Not just with music, but with youthful theatrics and sex appeal. A good song and a good voice weren't enough anymore. With the release from RCA in hand, I sat down to figure out what I would do next. That was 1985, and I learned that E.K. Gaylord, who owned Opryland USA and the Nashville Network, was starting a new label called 16th Avenue Records, and that my old RCA friend Jerry Bradley was going to run it. I signed with 16th Avenue right out of the chute, and the first record I cut on that label, Have I Got Some Blues for You, got into the top 10 on Billboard, and was #1 in Cashbox. I was happy to be working with Jerry again, and had high hopes for the new label. It only lasted 3 years, though. 16th Avenue was trying to work out a distribution arrangement with Capitol Records. And when that fell through, I was without a recording contract for the first time since walking through the door of Cedarwood Publishing Company on Music Row a quarter of a century before. Until the late 1980s, Branson, Missouri was just a small town in the Ozark Mountains where people went to fish, camp out, and water ski and take in the hillbilly jamborees. It is now one of the major entertainment centers in America, and was made that way by the dozen of senior artists who go there to sing to the throngs, 25 to 30,000 a day during the 8-month season. After 2 seasons of playing Branson, I decided to open my own theater there. The season runs from March through October, and in the spring and fall the crowds tend to be older. During the summer months, when schools are not in session, you see faces of all ages in the audience. I see long lines at the ticket booths and sold-out performances. People who have driven in from Ohio, Nevada, and Florida, and just about everywhere else in America to hear Mickey Gilley and Roy Clark and Ray Stevens and Willie Nelson and all the others. I'd like to second George Jones' message to the moguls. Don't count us out. We ain't dead yet. Fresh flowers were on the table when I arrived, and the dressing room had a glow of soft lighting and warmth of old friends. Billy Deaton, who booked some of my first gigs and now laughs about it, how he used to get me for $200 a night, was there. So was Jack Clement, my first producer, Tom Collins, who once ran my publishing company, Gene O'Neill, my first steel guitar player. Names and faces that reach across the decades brought a special touch to a special moment, my induction into an elite club, the official membership of the Grand Ole Opry. Nearly 25 years had passed since I first played the Opry. A few years after that, the Grand Ole Opry moved out of the Ryman, out of downtown Nashville, and into a theme park called Opryland USA. But the soul of the show, the singers and the musicians and the comics and the storytellers, moved with it. As a memorial to the past, a section of the old stage was transplanted into the new theater. The Opry is actually 4 shows spread over 2 nights, all of which are broadcast live over WSM radio. The first show begins at 6:30 Friday evening, after an intermission, during which the audience leaves and new patrons are seated. The second show runs until about midnight. The same procedures followed on Saturday night, except that 1 half-hour segment of the first show is televised live on the Nashville Network, a cable channel that reaches more than 50 million homes. I've had a standing invitation to join the club since 1960. Had not accepted purely out of financial and scheduling consideration. Members must commit to a certain number of appearances each year. When I was first invited to join, the commitment was to play more than 20 Saturdays a year, and the pay was only $8 a song. "We've got to look at it from an economic standpoint," Jack Johnson said, "son. We can't afford to give up that many Saturdays." Now, the time was right. Although I still maintain a full work schedule 8 or 9 months out of the year, the itinerary was such that the commitment to the Opry family created no hardship. Rather, it was an opportunity to snuggle closer to the roots of country music. A time or two in my life I've been accused of being egotistical, and I'm not even sure what that means. If it means that I'm satisfied and gratified to spend my life before an audience, then I'm guilty. If it means I take pride in the industry I've been a part of, I'm guilty. If it means I thrive on the appreciation of fans, then buddy, I am guilty. But I will share this with you. Performing is an experience for me that is as humbling as it is energizing. There's never a time on stage when I'm not aware that anyone on those faces looking up at me just as easily could be in my place and I could be down there watching them. I was blessed with an ability to sing, and for that I'm thankful. But it made me nothing special. It did allow me to be touched by the hearts of those who come to hear me sing.